Sheriff's Deputy Timothy Allen Ross stood on the sidewalk outside of his hometown's only police station. A single-story building, small and compact, and made of brick. It had a lobby, a few break rooms, a common area where officers could work at their desks, private offices for the more senior officers, and a single hallway that wound around the whole building. There were also 2 interrogation rooms for officers to talk to suspects or witnesses, though crimes in the area which warranted their use were so rare that Ross had only ever seen one being used at a time, and never both. Standing on the curb next to Ross was his superior and friend, Sheriff James Anderson Vincenzo. Friend was perhaps not close enough for the descriptor. Despite Vincenzo being his senior by around 20 years, he and Ross were as close as brothers. Ross had been the good sheriff's deputy, standing beside him loyally throughout the toughest cases, and throughout the hellish previous months. It was now a spring day. The grass and trees, all fresh, bright green in color, in their corner of the world had calmed down after enduring a hellish winter, though it wasn't back to normal. Around them, the blocks, streets, and closely packed homes were silent, still, and deserted of all people. Ross and Vincenzo were both in uniform, looking almost as if they were ready to watch for people speeding or jaywalking. They wore crisp, clean, navy blue button-up shirts, complete with leggings of the same color that went down to their ankles, and black boots that were clean enough to reflect an image like a mirror. Both also wore a hat of the same blue color, had their badges on, and had their service pistols strapped into their holsters. Both were clean and shaven, still looking professional in appearance, even if that didn't really matter anymore. At Ross's feet was a bag of guns, with ammunition for each one, and another bag loaded with supplies. Vincenzo had 2 identical bags and was placing them in the back bed of his own personal pickup truck. Each had packed bags for their own respective journeys. Both were about to set out and leave their small hometown, which had a population of less than 6,000 people ever since it was founded, usually being closer to 2,000 or 3,000, for good. The town was located in the central region of western Ohio, almost directly in the middle between the northern and southern border of the state. Not far from the Indiana border. In fact, the town ran right up to a bridge that separated the 2 states. If one walked to the river on that side of town and stopped on the bank, they could look across and maybe see someone in the Hoosier state wave back on a nice day. Personal watercraft would have been a common sight, zooming either upstream or downstream as people enjoyed being out on the water on a nice day. Those days were all gone, though, and unlikely to return anytime soon. The town was deserted. As far as the officers could tell, for the last week they'd been the only 2 human beings left in the whole place. Most people had stayed put in their homes initially when the anomaly, the term that had unofficially been given to it, but seemed universally accepted for the name of it, began putting strain on the seams of the civilized world. Things had been on shaky ground for a while, but remained manageable. But that changed during the middle of the winter months. The seams which held society together, normalcy in daily life, and an uninterrupted supply chain, finally broke in most of the country west of the Appalachian Mountains. Things went bad, and for a while no one thought it could get worse. When things went exceptionally bad, people began fleeing. First 1 or 2 families at a time, then whole blocks left in droves. They left looking for somewhere where things would be better, not that that existed anywhere in the United States at that point, other than in Washington, D.C., which had closed itself off from the outside in an effort to give the illusion of normalcy continuing at the capital. Of a functioning government working and getting close to solving what was an unsolvable problem. Everywhere was in the same situation the town had been in. Some places, in fact, were far worse. There was simply nowhere to go, and if anyone did try to travel to the capital of the country for shelter, the roads had been barricaded by National Guardsmen who turned them away with pointed weapons. Meandering people congested the roads, or in the bigger cities, simply began to riot. And when people couldn't travel on the main roads, they'd try their luck on the back roads, but many simply dead-ended in isolated areas and people found themselves lost. Compared to several places, the The small town near the Ohio border Ross had grown up in was almost unaffected by the worst events. Other people simply fled society altogether, retreating deep into the forest to camp in small parties and try to wait the apocalypse out in an isolated area. An area far from help, which resulted in such groups often falling prey to various reborn, once extinct carnivores. It was perhaps the most terrifying way to die one could think of. Being hunted by an animal which didn't and couldn't understand what you were more than you could understand it in return. Ross could imagine a group of people deep in a forest being attacked by a pack of prehistoric carnivores of all shapes and sizes, despite any kind of weaponry that they might have had. Some people seemed to think and hope that the dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals would vanish again just like they'd appeared, and things would go back to normal after. Makeshift villages had been set up in campgrounds in some state and national parks around the country by some refugees fleeing the heavily populated areas, according to a few rumors at any rate. The only one Ross knew to be verified was the one people had established at the Indiana Dunes State Park on the shoreline of Lake Michigan. Most rumors of state park campgrounds being turned into small communities seemed to come out of Indiana. No one seemed to be doing the same thing in Ohio. Despite the small town being relatively untouched by most of the worst effects going on around the country, and Vincenzo's constant urges for people to stay, it didn't dissuade people from acting rashly. Hearing rumors of possible safe places made people want to try to find them and stay there, but most didn't seem to really exist. People nonetheless continued to steadily leave, convinced that they'd find a better place to ride the anomaly's effects out, until finally, a week prior, the last family in the town had packed up and left, leaving Sheriff Vincenzo and Deputy Ross the only ones in the town. And since there was now no one left to protect, they were sure of it. It was clear things would never go back to the way they had been. The two were also about to set off. Despite the effort perhaps being fruitless, they and other officers they'd had until they too had left with their families had done their best to protect everyone for as long as they could. Now those people were scattered all over and none would likely ever come back. Ross had known the day would eventually come after the first families left, and now it had. Everyone was gone. He and Vincenzo had only stayed because neither had families. They were the closest thing to it each other had. Vincenzo placed the bag of supplies in the bed of his police department issued pickup truck and the bag of guns in the back seat. He closed the door and turned to Ross. "So, what are you going to do next?" Vincenzo asked. "I'm going to head east. Things might be slightly more stable on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. It sounds like the East Coast got off the lightest in all this. If I can make it that far, anyway. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll find somewhere to settle down before there." Ross looked down for a moment at Vincenzo's question, before looking back up. "I'm not sure where I'm going to go," the deputy admitted. "You want to come with me?" Vincenzo asked. "You're more than welcome." Ross smiled ever so slightly. He sighed and nodded. "Truthfully, yeah, I do," he admitted. "But you're not going to," Vincenzo replied. Ross sighed. I just got a feeling. I need to go elsewhere. My gut says head south," Ross replied. Vincenzo looked Ross in the eyes and nodded in acceptance. He stepped forward and pulled his deputy into a hug, which Ross returned. It was a long hug, like family members would share if it was the last time that they'd see each other again for a very long time. As they pulled back, Vincenzo grabbed Ross's hand and shook it. "Kick this New World's ass," he said, clapping his deputy on the shoulder one final time. Ross nodded. "You do the same. You've done a great job so far. I don't think even a T-Rex would dare cross you," he replied with a light chuckle. Though he knew they likely wouldn't, Ross nonetheless added, "Maybe we'll meet again in the future." Though he also knew that they likely wouldn't, Vincenzo entertained the notion with a nod. "Maybe," he said, preparing to take his leave of his deputy, best friend, and hometown for the last time. He'd already packed what he wanted to keep from his home, so once he'd hit the road, there'd be no turning back. Maybe things will settle down soon and people will get their heads back on their shoulders instead of panicking. Vincenzo deeply sighed. Good luck, he said after a moment. Ross nodded. You too, he replied, looking around for a moment before putting his hands on his hips and sighing. I don't have a vehicle. Ross's police department issued pickup truck had been stolen by one of the other officers when they'd fled the town weeks before. Vincenzo nodded in understanding. The last squad car parked behind the station is mine. Clearly I'm not going to need it, he said, motioning to his truck. You're welcome to take it. The keys are in the upper right drawer of my desk in the station. Ross smiled slightly. Thanks, he said, shaking Vincenzo's hand again. Vincenzo had 2 vehicles issued to him by the department, a squad car and a pickup truck. He was taking the pickup truck, so he had no need for the squad car anymore. And even if it would have left him without a vehicle, he would have offered his own truck to his deputy nonetheless. With their final handshake, the two let go and Ross took a step back, nodding gratefully. With a final nod and smile conveying well wishes in return, you could never have too many in the dangerous new world they were setting off into. Vincenzo turned away and got into his truck. The sheriff started the engine, which roared to life like a bellowing dinosaur, put the vehicle into drive, and pulled away from the sidewalk and onto the street. Ross stayed on the sidewalk and watched Vincenzo's truck drive away until it turned a corner and vanished from sight, leaving him alone. Ross sighed, looking at the empty police station behind him and then around at the empty town before he started walking. He left the bags on the sidewalk. There was no one around to steal them after all. And instead of going into the station, he set off on a walk through his town one last time. Slowly walking up the street away from the station, Ross began looking around and taking in the familiar sights of the town he'd grown up in. One that only a year before had been as lively as any close-knit small town was. And although it had been, it didn't look at all abandoned yet. Though the homes were all empty, and many people's possessions were scattered, left behind in driveways and yards in front of the houses, forgotten due to hurried departures, the town itself didn't look abandoned, yet. A few cars were still parked on the streets outside of homes, grass in the yards was still trimmed and short. No yard was overgrown yet due to how short amount of time had passed since people began fleeing. Nothing was in ruins yet. It looked like at any moment people would walk out of the front doors of their homes, adults about to go to work who would give him a friendly wave, or children about to play a game of tag, or a version involving water balloons if it was summer, or the family pet peeking out at him from one of the windows as he walked by the house. For now, it was all frozen in time, a monument to a world only living in people's memories. It all looked like that there should have been people all over the place going about their daily activities, but there was just no one. Ross continued walking, like a cop patrolling his town for troublemakers, in uniform and his face stern. The feeling of seeing it all empty filled him with a feeling that he just couldn't put into words. At the end of one house's driveway, a trash can was knocked over, and Ross wondered what had caused it. Could have been knocked over by the homeowners as they fled, could have been knocked over by raccoons looting it, or even by some animal that had been extinct for 300 million years. The sight of a knocked over trash can would have never made it bat an eye before, but it did now, because it was just another thing that raised a question which he'd never have an answer to. Ross had walked the streets of his little Western Ohio hometown thousands of times, and he never thought about the fact that one day it would be for the last time. And he knew, though, that this was that day, the last time he'd passed the familiar sights of his hometowns that he thought he'd see throughout his entire life. A town he never thought he'd see left empty like it was now. He never thought that he'd be the last person left in the town either. Ross passed his old school, and looking at it made him think of all his childhood friends. He passed a diner he and his buddies in high school would always go to almost every day after school, and it now sat dark and empty. He passed a bar that the same buddies went to every Friday to meet up and hang out after they'd grown into adults, and Ross had sworn one night that he'd join them, but never had actually gotten around to doing it, and now he never would. And he'd never know what happened to those buddies either. Had some of them been in one of the groups who retreated to the forest and been hunted by prehistoric predators? Or were they all still alive and scattered across the state? He'd never know. Ross took his eyes off the bar and kept walking. Eventually, Ross came to the town park. Leaving the street, the deputy walked through the also still short grass and sat down at a swing set. Another one that held memories because his friends and him would swing there as young kids. Ross had always sat on the rightmost swing at the end, and now he sat in the same place, still with that same feeling inside of him. It wasn't denial. He'd accepted that the old world was gone already. It was perhaps akin to sadness, but sadness didn't encompass the feeling either. Emptiness, aimless emptiness, perhaps came closest to the feeling inside of him. As he idly swung himself back and forth with gentle pushes of his legs, Ross remembered his childhood friends and wondered where they all were then, and where they had ended up when things fell apart. He'd never know. Knowing he would never know about what happened to so many people he cared for hit hard. Everyone was gone. Now the town of so many memories was empty, save for him. And everyone in those memories were all missing, or just gone. All their possessions, their homes, and everything they'd worked for had been left behind, abandoned, left to crumble into nothing. And the people had scattered into an unstable, dangerous world where no one knew what to expect, other than a desperate fight for survival. A noise coming from elsewhere in the park eventually made Ross look up. He didn't know how long he'd sat on the swing set, but the sun had certainly moved since he'd sat down. Standing, the officer placed a hand on his holstered service pistol and walked in the direction of the noise with caution. His duties as a police officer forced him to investigate anything where someone might have been in trouble. Nonetheless, he didn't rush in. If there was a dangerous animal from 65 million years ago lurking nearby, he didn't want to draw its attention to him. He approached slow and kept a firm grasp on his pistol, which was ready to be drawn from its holster at a moment's notice if it was needed. Ross snuck up to a tree for cover and slowly walked around it, and stopped once he had a clear view of the source of the noise. His hand slid off the grip of his gun and back to his side as Ross laid eyes on what had drawn his attention in the first place. It wasn't a person in need, or something that was particularly dangerous if he kept his distance and didn't aggravate it. Sauntering around a large open section of the park was a herd of triceratops. It was only a small herd, consisting of only 3 or 4 adults of each gender. It was hard to tell due to the lack of obvious sexual dimorphism between male and females. The animals were bellowing deeply to each other and mingling around a small collection of nests. As the males wandered around, grazing and keeping an eye out for threats, the females were tending to the fresh hatchlings within the nests, dropping chewed greens into their mists for their hatchlings. Small herd of dinosaurs for now, but one that would soon be much larger in size. Ross sighed as he watched the dinosaurs. The sight of them just being there in his town, hit him hard. Despite everything he had seen over the last months, the sight of the dinosaurs was truly the final nail being struck into place in his acceptance that the old world was really gone for good and a new, crazy, mixed-up one had taken its place. A world where people would be scattered and struggling to survive. A world where they would be for the foreseeable future, if not forever. The deputy watched the dinosaurs, none of which even so much as glanced at him, for a few minutes before he slowly turned and walked back in the direction he'd come from. They weren't the first prehistoric animals to wander into the town. but they were the first ones to show up in several weeks. They were also the first dinosaurs to appear in what was essentially the center of the town itself, rather than in the outskirts like all the other animals had done so far. But with no people to spook them, they boldly sauntered in and claimed a spot for their own. Leaving the park, Ross walked back to the station and retrieved the bag that he'd left on the curb before approaching the doors. Opening one of the front doors, which were fully made of glass and the morning sunlight shone brightly into the building, Ross stepped back inside of the empty station and found his gaze wandering once again. Full year before, it had been so full of activity and life, but now it seemed dull and dead. Ross set his bags down on the floor in the empty lobby and stood in the middle of the room. He again found himself beginning to reflect on the things that were now gone for good, the world he knew rather than this new one that he didn't. This time it wasn't on friends, but rather on his fellows. The officers he'd served with, drank coffee with each morning, even ate a donut or two with. Now that was all gone too, just like the friends he'd never gone to have a drink with were. The officers had stayed for a long time, loyal to each other and the people they served. Even as things around the country began crumbling, they worked as a team to maintain order in the town despite people's growing fear and the occasional appearance of one of the reborn animals on their streets. From dromaeosaurs to large terrestrial crocodiles. Then, in the middle of winter, things had changed. People began fleeing the town, and the officers steadily began doing the same, taking their families and trying to find someplace better. The change had occurred after one single event in the winter, a cold night which Ross recalled vividly. A night which snowflakes were falling and the streets were illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights. It was the very early morning hours, and up to that point every officer had stayed and gone far beyond the call of duty. Some families had left, but most had stayed home up to that point as well, hoping to wait the worst of the crisis out in a familiar place, under the protection and guidance of the law enforcement they knew and trusted. It wasn't a hard decision to come to. There were rumors that out on the West Coast, where the anomaly had caused nearly everything to completely break down, that civilians were being taken into camps by the military for their own protection, but strict rationing, harsh living conditions, and a breakdown in supply chains had even caused those areas to erupt into chaos. There were even rumors of cannibalism occurring in some camps in California once the strictly rationed supplies all but ran out. People were more than willing to try and keep the same thing from happening to them and stay together in their town until the chaos that gripped the West Coast had reached them. It reached them that night. On the night that things changed, Ross and Vincenzo were at the station. Outside on the same curb they'd said goodbye on months later, talking about plans for organizing an ongoing evacuation. An endless line of vehicles pouring into their town to cross the bridge over to Indiana. Every officer was on duty. Several state police had also come to help manage. And the traffic had jammed the main highway that left the city. But it had been moving throughout the night. The cars had steadily been able to move across the bridge that led out of the town and into a nearly identical one in Indiana. As Ross and Vincenzo had been talking about the progress and looking at a map, discussing a possible reroute for part of the line to another nearby town with a similar bridge, several military copters flew very low overhead. They'd been doing so all night, so at most people only glanced up to watch them fly towards the west. Minutes later, there had been a massive boom that shook the air. Ross and Vincenzo both had instantly turned to face the direction of the boom, as several distant screams began to break out. They, alongside several other officers and civilians, had run to a nearby hill that overlooked the bridge and river, and stopped as if anchored to the ground once they got there, unable to look away. The helicopters were dropping bombs onto the center of the bridge, which was full of stalled, gridlocked traffic. Several large, fiery explosions illuminated the horror of the scene, turning the water below into a fiery golden color. People's screams echoed throughout the air, along with honking horns as drivers tried to spur the other cars around them into moving, and as the center of the bridge finally collapsed into the river, cutting the route that connected Indiana and Ohio off. Multiple cars loaded with families had tumbled off as well and crashed into the water below. Ross had never felt so helpless or angry as he did as he stood on the hill and watched it all happen. The official reason for the act was that it had been an effort to slow down the spread of the anomaly's effects, but that was just a scapegoat. It had started in the West, yes, but by the time efforts were made to quarantine off that part of the country as much as possible, the anomaly had already gone not just countrywide, but also global. That same night, after the helicopters had flown away, one more thing had happened across the river that dashed many hopes. The civilized world was plunged into darkness, effectively dying as far as many were concerned. The people on the hill watched as the lights in Indiana, isolated homes and riverside towns alike, as far as they could see in both directions, up and downstream, began to blink out. First a few houses, then entire blocks of towns, and it spread quickly until that entire side of the river was cast into a total blackout as the electrical grid collapsed. While the lights in Ohio hadn't gone out yet, that didn't matter. Seeing the lights, including the ones in the town just across the bridge, go dark was more than enough to break most people, especially after they'd all been witness to such a horrifying event. That night was the event that had led to the change. It was only after it had occurred that officers began leaving the town as well. Seeing the desperate lengths that the government had gone to in order to stop the event from spreading had caused people to panic. Many feared forests or towns would be bombed next, or that the people across the Midwest would be taken to internment camps just like those on the West Coast had been. In the end, what had been done to stop the spreading chaos had the total opposite effect that it desired. It only sped up the pacing of things falling apart rather than stop or slow it down. Even the officers who had faithfully stayed and done their duty had been shaken to that point, to the point of fleeing even, one by one, taking their families and going. And when the cops started leaving the town, the people panicked and did the same, sometimes one by one and other times in droves. The bombing had done one other thing besides cause the unstable situation to become more volatile. It also limited the directions people could go and run in. With as many of the easy access points westward being destroyed as possible, Ross had heard over a shortwave radio that the same thing had occurred all the way down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. People were forced to either go north, south, or east, which only further increased the amounts of traffic jam-ups. Many roads were rendered unusable due to the buildup of endless lines of cars that never moved, and that further limited people's ability to move around. In the end, the bombing and attempted quarantine had only made it harder for people rather than help them. Families were cut off from each other. Many in Indiana, Ohio, and even Kentucky would likely never meet again, with all the bridges everywhere destroyed like the ones outside the town had been. Their only chance would have been to try crossing by boat, but there were now things swimming in the murky water that made such a crossing almost too dangerous to attempt, unless one had access to a fast boat of some type, or a large vessel that wouldn't be attacked. If anyone tried to cross by canoe or raft, they'd likely be picked off by one of the numerous underwater predators patrolling the water. Animals once separated by millions of years that now had to compete for the same food sources. Occasional chewed pieces of kayaks or paddles drifting in the current or washing ashore on the riverbank were ominous signs of failed crossings. Wedged into the plastic of one kayak that had drifted onto the shore after being bitten in half around 2 months back, Ross had found a frighteningly large tooth something big had left behind. That same overcast day, Ross had found a bottle washed up on the same bank with a note inside of it. The note told as frightening of a story as the mangled plastic kayak. It had been hastily written and was very short. Engine destroyed. Drifting downriver. Boat going down. Something big is following our boat. Yacht is overloaded and everyone is confused. I write this to warn you. Don't try crossing a body of water. Stay on land. You're safer. People gave up trying to cross the rivers rather quickly, and signs of failed crossings disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared. Ross found himself once again sighing. The first sign of things to come had been during an initially nondescript week of October, the year before, the morning. An odd call had come in, and Ross had volunteered to go check it out, and it turned out to be the most bizarre scene he'd ever visited. On a back road near the town, a farmer had reported a collision with a large unidentifiable animal. Upon arriving, Ross quickly realized why the caller had been so confused and alarmed about something that they'd described as a large bird of some kind. It was indeed a bird of some sort, the feathers had told Ross that, but that was all he could figure out. The thing did not appear anything like a bird in the region ought to have looked. And at the end of its fingers were 3 large claws. It was roughly the size of a turkey, but clearly wasn't one. Ross knew now that it was a young Therizinosaurus that the farmer had run over, but at the time, he didn't even have a guess on what the animal's identity could have been. It being a dinosaur was the last thing on his mind. While on scene, he'd reported the animal to Vincenzo over the radio, and Vincenzo just didn't seem to grasp the strangeness of the animal. In fact, the sheriff had suggested it was just a deformed turkey and nothing more. Ross had put the animal in a box and taken it to the station, and once Vincenzo saw it, he began taking it more seriously. He'd immediately made phone calls. They'd been hopeful that the conservation officer from the next district over, their own didn't have one at the time, would be able to identify the animal. After paying them a visit, though, even the wildlife expert had been stumped. Out of everyone in the room, that should have been someone who knew immediately what all the local wildlife was. It had to be something from the area. No escapes from zoos or other places with captive birds had been reported. That was around the time that people had started taking the strange animal sightings, which were growing more and more frequent, more seriously. While reflecting on all of this, Ross had sat at his desk, but he eventually emerged from his thoughts and stood up. Combined with how long he'd sat at his desk and on the swing, the morning was almost gone. It was time to go. He went to Vincenzo's office and stepped inside. It was dark inside, with no windows, and the building not having any power for the lights, but daylight illuminating the hallway from the front doors provided enough light in the room for it to have a dim gloom. Ross approached the desk at the center of the room. He opened the drawer Vincenzo had mentioned and took out the keys to the squad car and stuffed them into his pocket. Leaving the office, Ross then made his way through the empty station and searched through the rooms one last time for anything overlooked that might prove useful in the world he was about to set off into. He only took a few small items here and there and left most things others had discarded untouched. However, after finding one of the gun cabinets was still full, Ross had gone back to his desk and taken a small padlock and key out from it. He returned to the case, which contained 10 pump-action shotguns and plenty of ammunition for each one to be useful for an extended amount of time. He shut the door and locked it with the padlock, without taking anything from it beforehand. Ross didn't take any because he already had a bag full of guns, and he thought that knowing a sure place he could find more sometime in the future might be useful. With that in mind, he put the key to the lock, the only key to it, on a ring and hooked it onto his belt to keep it separate from Vincenzo's keys, so he'd always know which one it was. Finally, there was nothing more to do. Ross retrieved his bags from the lobby and went to the station's back door, where the force's vehicles were parked. Only one car remained, parked along the back wall of the station. Ross approached it, opened the door, and placed his bags into the back seat before closing the door again. Looking around, he took a moment to process the fact that this was it. He was really about to go, for good. He was leaving his hometown behind forever. Despite leaving a stash behind, in all likelihood Ross knew he'd probably never return. So finally, with probably his 50th sigh of the day, Ross took one last look around and opened the car door. Sitting in the driver's seat and pulling out Vincenzo's keys, Ross pulled the door shut and started the engine. Seeing the gas tank was full, Ross put the vehicle in reverse, backed out of the spot, pulled forward and out onto the road. He saluted the station and town with a few short whistles of the siren. He then circled around the station and began driving in the same direction Vincenzo had earlier. However, instead of turning where the sheriff had, Ross went straight and drove until he was leaving the busy part of his town behind. The street lights on the utility poles ended and the houses grew scattered. And then there were only fields with dotted woodland on all sides, and the town welcome sign passed by his window, vanishing in Ross's rear view quickly, and he was officially off. He set his jaw and didn't look back as he left it, and those people he knew so well, all behind for good. For the rest of the morning and into the early afternoon, Ross drove the car south. Following an interstate winding through the western side of Ohio, Ross made steady progress. He'd had to travel east towards the central region of the state for a time, heading in the general direction of Marion, before merging onto the interstate he could take south. Now that he had found the road, not only went south, but also was slowly working its way back toward the west side of the state as well. As the day continued to pass, hours passing by like the unending fields on all sides of the road, Ross was surprised, but thankful that the road was mostly unobstructed. One of the officers' biggest worries was coming up to a jammed-up line of cars somewhere that would have left the road unpassable. Thankfully, so far that hadn't been the case. There had only been abandoned cars and small pile-ups here and there so far, and they were easily avoided. Eventually, though, Ross's luck did run out. As he drove along a curve and out of yet another forest into an area of open fields, with only electrical towers and the occasional houses dotted around as far as he could see, he had to slow down. Ahead, he saw that every lane of the road was blocked by a massive line of jammed, abandoned cars. He'd since left Interstate 76 and detoured around to get onto Route 127 to avoid the exact situation he was in now. Who would have guessed an isolated highway would have ended up being blocked instead of the heavily used interstate? He stopped his car at the end of the jam up and sighed. "Shit," he muttered, leaning back and just staring at the scene. He slowly let off the brake and eased his car forward, around one of the vehicles at the end of the pileup, and stopped it again just as quickly. It was an all but impossible obstacle to pass. Cars stretched on ahead as far as he could see, and off the side of the road too. In theory, maybe there was enough space for him to worm his car through, but it would take hours upon hours for sure, and he didn't want to be stuck on the road at night. And if it hadn't rained a few days prior, he'd have just driven in the field to go around, but getting his vehicle stuck out there wouldn't have helped his situation any. Being stranded out there where there was no cover sounded like a bad situation waiting to happen. Knowing how far back he'd have to backtrack in order to find a route to bypass the area, Ross decided that he didn't have the time to spare. It was best to keep moving forward at a slower pace than lose several hours of trying to find a way around. There even was one, because who knew what state the other highways would be in? With that in mind, Ross turned off the engine and stuffed the keys into his uniform pocket. Opening the door, Ross stepped out onto the pavement and looked around for a moment before going to the back door and opening it as well. Pulling his bags out, Ross took a drink of water from a bottle before slinging both bags over his shoulder. Looking back inside his vehicle, Ross spotted the radio, and after a moment he decided to chance talking into it. Turning it on and grabbing the receiver, he lifted it to his mouth. "Hello? Vincenzo, are you there?" Only static greeted him in response. He tried again. "Vincenzo, it's Ross, do you copy?" He was rewarded with the same response, so he sighed and tried something else. "Hello? Does anyone hear my voice?" he asked, leaning against the open driver's side door as he spoke. "This is an emergency channel. Does anybody hear me? This is the sheriff's deputy speaking. Can anyone hear me?" Again, he got no answer, so he just sighed and lifted the receiver to his mouth one more time. "Well, if you do, just some friendly advice. Stay off Route 127 north of Cincinnati. It's completely fucked. Mark your maps." With that, he placed the receiver back in its place and turned the radio off. As he leaned back out of the car, he looked ahead towards the traffic jam again. Ross stood next to the car for a moment before settling his nerve and committed to walking forward and hoping to find a new vehicle on the other side of the car jam up. As he took his supplies from the patrol vehicle, closed the doors and started to walk away from it, leaving it sitting on the road, Ross looked back briefly, feeling like he was saying goodbye to a friend, or at least the last part of one that he had left. The area was silent, save for the wind and buzzing or chirping insects as Ross walked his way through the vehicles. He glanced into the windows of each as he passed, seeing most were loaded with supplies and seemed to have been hastily abandoned. Despite so many vehicles being full of supplies for the taking, it didn't seem like anyone had been around for weeks. He didn't like that. Whatever caused the snarl of cars must have been further ahead, because all the vehicles he passed were parked and not crashed together. Ross guessed that something happened further ahead that caused traffic to become backed up, maybe for miles. There were no people in sight, and no bodies, and a glance around the area and the surrounding fields showed the same. There seemed to be no one in the area but him, and the wide space was still devoid of any animal life, prehistoric or modern. Where did everybody go? He thought. They must have all been held up in secure places in hiding. As he navigated through the mess, he didn't see anything of note until one car caught his eye. All the vehicles he'd passed up to that point had obviously been sitting in their spots for weeks at least, but this one he was looking at now was clean, and seemed like it had only been sitting in that spot for a few days. Ross stopped short of it and eyed up the vehicle, looking for any sign of a person being in it or nearby. It seemed someone had tried to do what Ross decided against, and squeeze their car through the mess, an endeavor doomed before it even began. Maybe a smaller car could have pulled it off, but not the large silver SUV in front of him. The vehicle had skidded to a stop in the grass off the right side of the highway, not fully in the field that ran alongside the road, but rather just in the grass buffer. It had crashed, front bumper first, into an open trailer used to haul small vehicles that a white truck had been towing. The truck was still attached to the trailer. It sat on the road, while the trailer seemed to have swung off the side of it. It didn't seem damaged, but the driver had clearly bailed for some reason. The crash was also clearly recent, occurring after the truck was abandoned, and Ross could see an old man's partially bald head inside the SUV's window. He was slumped forward over the steering wheel. It was the first car to have anyone in it. Seeing the victim, Ross slowly set his bags down on the pavement and, by instinct, once again became an officer whose job it was to serve the people. Once a cop, always a cop. You don't stop serving those in need ever, even in an apocalypse. At least he didn't stop. Placing his hand on his pistol, Ross slowly approached the crashed car. As he got nearer, he saw the grass around the vehicle was marked by multiple large, three-toed footprints from a large theropod dinosaur. Maybe from a Tyrannosaurus rex or something of similar size. He didn't know any of the large theropods outside of that one by name, but he knew there were several. Ross's grasp on his pistol tightened as he saw the prints, and he again stopped, now just a few steps from the car. There was no movement, and the only sound was the whistle of the wind. Ross turned his head and scanned the fields on all sides, but they remained empty of animals. So with the area still empty, the fields only being dotted with the stalks of dead corn, Ross decided it would be safe to speak up. "Sir, are you okay? Police officer here," Ross called out in a loud voice. Not getting a verbal response or seeing any movement prompted Ross to close the rest of the distance to the vehicle. Upon still getting no response, Ross reached out and opened the vehicle's driver's side door. "Sir," he said, placing a hand on the old man's shoulder and leaning him back against the seat. His body was stiff. Ross lowered his arm to his side. The man had committed suicide by slicing his wrists with a small blade that he still was grasping in his hand. Likely after his car had struck the trailer, or maybe because of whatever had been circling around the vehicle after the wreck. The man's eyes were still open, vacant, and seemed to still hold a trace of sadness. Ross shook his head, wishing the man had waited before taking such an action, but he resigned to the fact that there was nothing he could do. Ross couldn't blame the old man. It was a better way to go than possibly being eaten alive or trapped in the car for weeks. Stepping back, he shut the vehicle door again and left the man be. Retrieving his bags from where he dropped them, Ross slowly slung them over his shoulder. and continued walking. He'd seen many dead bodies, he'd seen many crashes, he'd seen many situations where he couldn't help someone. There had been times where he could only hold the victim's hand while they died. But that one hit him differently than the others. Maybe because it was his first in the apocalypse, first in a world where he couldn't help people like he used to. Maybe because he had been almost no help to people for the last months. And yet he knew he couldn't stop being a cop despite all that. He still took the motto of serving the people to heart. Just because the civilized world had crumbled, taking law and order with it, didn't mean he was no longer a cop. The jammed line of cars seemed to have no end. Ross had passed hundreds as he continued walking, and the pileups seemed to just keep going. Both his and the crashed car were now far behind him. The forest he'd driven out of before stopping his car was barely still visible. The tops of the trees were all you could see over the roofs of the cars, and there were no trees in the fields which surrounded him on all sides now. The tallest thing in view other than the largest cars were the electrical towers which extended across the countryside. High above, the sun was bright in the blue sky, which was dotted with puffy clouds clumped into isolated groups. It was bright enough, and still high, and Ross was thankful he had his hat to shield his eyes. As he walked, he continued scanning around and kept his face clear of emotion. His eyes were in a squint and his mouth in a flat line. Ross paused to take a breath when he heard a sound coming from the other side of one of the nearest rows of cars. Something had fallen over onto the pavement. It sounded like a bucket falling and spilling its contents onto the road. Ross quickly looked behind him and in the direction the sound had come from. He knew that something could have simply fallen over, but also if something was simply going to fall over, then surely it would have done it weeks ago. In all likelihood, Ross knew that there was every chance that whatever fell had been knocked over by something. Scanning the cars, Ross didn't see anything moving. Deciding after a moment that it might have in fact just been something fallen over, he turned and continued walking. Then, he heard something trilling from the same spot the other sound had come from. Turning around again, knowing something was definitely there now, Ross again scanned the cars for any sign of movement, but there was nothing to be seen. A little shook, Ross turned away again and decided to just keep walking. But once again he found himself turning around because of another new sound. This time it was the soft click of claws and the stepping of heavy feet. "Oh shit," Ross quietly muttered. He dropped his bags and pulled one of the rifles out from the gun bag. Raising it up, he continued trying to spot whatever was making the sound, since it was undeniably something alive. He heard sniffing coming from the other side of the trucks and aimed the rifle in that direction. He caught a glimpse of something behind the truck, but he couldn't get a full view of it. It wasn't coming towards him. In fact, it seemed to be content simply sniffing around the cars, walking in a bit of a loop, rather than trying to come at him. Now that he had an identification on the unknown animal's location, and since it didn't seem to be interested in him, Ross decided to just get away rather than waste a bullet. Better to carry on before it became interested in him and to save the supplies, Ross decided, though it was certainly creepy how he had been so close to it and had no idea it was there. He'd passed within one car's width of the shape only a few seconds prior and been none the wiser. Picking his bags up, he began walking at a quickened pace away from the spot. Glancing back over his shoulder one final time after only walking a few steps, Ross stopped. There was a face looking at him through the dirty windows of a nearby truck. A large, brown, bird-like face with forward-facing wide eyes and small pupils focused on him like laser pointers. The deputy felt like he was hit with a bolt when he saw those eyes. It was standing as still as stone on the other side of the truck, gazing through the vehicle at him, unmoving. "Screw being quiet," Ross said, not about to risk that thing following him, especially since the last time he saw a strange bird-like animal it turned out to be a dinosaur. That was also most definitely what he was looking at the moment. Not even dropping his bags, he pumped the shotgun, aimed it at the truck window on the opposite side of what the dinosaur was looking through. "Get out of here!" he roared at the top of his lungs, firing a bullet into the glass. The windows on both sides of the truck exploded, and the thing squawked in alarm and ran off towards the nearest patch of trees, claws slapping the pavement with each step it took. It was gone so quick that Ross didn't even get a good look at it. All he saw was a flash of brown and black spotted feathers at the end of a tail as the thing turned to run. And that was it. Ross lowered the rifle as the footsteps quickly faded and sighed in relief. He didn't know if the thing would even have followed him. In truth, he even doubted it, because it hadn't seemed too interested in him. It had only seemed to realize that Ross was there around the same time he realized it was there, and once it had, it didn't try to follow him. It just looked at him. And while Ross didn't know much about dinosaurs, such as behavior or hunting patterns, he did know that many of them had lots of teeth and big claws, and that was more than enough reasons to scare it off. As a kid, Ross had once had a nightmare about a raptor attacking him with its sickle claws after watching a movie about dinosaurs on late-night TV, and the thing he'd seen through the window seemed very raptor-like in shape. Either way, if that one had been aggressive or not, Ross wasn't willing to chance it following him. And once the animal was gone, he turned and finally was able to keep going. As soon as the cars thinned out and he was out of the traffic jam, Ross decided his first act would be to find a new vehicle. Not much further up the road, Ross crested a hill and a skyline came into view. There, still and silent, was Cincinnati. Ross stopped for a moment to take the view in. Scanning the buildings, he saw no movement anywhere in any of them. The place appeared abandoned and dead. People had apparently fled from here too, just like they had back at his hometown. Though he could make out the details of the buildings, he was able to see each window in the skyscrapers. He was still several miles north of the city, and if he didn't find a vehicle, he'd be hard-pressed to get there before the sun started going down. Starting forward again, the vehicles began to thin out, and he could see the road ahead was empty. It was clear now that he'd finally left the worst of the jam behind. One of the last vehicles stopped was a white truck, towing a car-hauler trailer with two gas-powered scooters strapped into the back. They were the kind that had a seat of their own, and they needed a key to start. This vehicle also had its driver's side door open, but upon inspecting, Ross found that the keys had been taken when the owner fled. Though the truck's keys hadn't been left in it, a quick search of the interior cabin resulted in Ross locating the key to one of the scooters in the back trailer. It might not have been the fastest means of transportation, but it was still an increase in speed compared to walking. Ross went back to the trailer and got one of the scooters free after determining which one the key belonged to. Unstrapping it and rolling it down the back ramp onto the road, Ross retrieved his possessions, he sat down on the seat, and started the scooter. It puttered to life and began idling. Ross slowly maneuvered around the truck and increased his speed once only the open, unobstructed road was ahead of him, and he started driving towards the city. He knew he was well into the city limits when the tall skyscrapers suddenly rose around him on all sides like giant fence posts. Driving slowly down the streets, he saw no one. His assessment that the city had been abandoned like his town seemed to be accurate, though Ross wouldn't be surprised if some scattered people were still around, so he remained on guard as he continued driving. It was a weird feeling, seeing a place that would have once been so packed with people to be so utterly still and silent. It was eerie. He continued driving slowly, heading further into the city, the rev of his scooter engine echoing down the silent streets. Soon the tall buildings surrounded him on all sides, with 1- or 2-story buildings mixed in here and there with the multi-story skyscrapers which made up the skyline. All the while, no matter how far into the city Ross drove, no people or animals of any kind appeared anywhere in his sight. It didn't seem possible that the whole place was deserted. Ross increased his speed, and the engine revved louder. Being the sole inhabitant in such a place felt wrong. It was too much of a liminal space for him to feel comfortable. The lack of people in the center of the city was eerie and wrong, but that unsettling feeling of emptiness evaporated only a few moments later. Coming to one of the seemingly endless four-way intersections in the city, Ross turned around a corner to go left and hit the brake the second he saw what was around the turn. The building on the corner he was driving past prevented him from seeing what was waiting for him on the street he'd turned onto. Standing on the side of the street he'd turned onto, not far from where he was idling on the scooter, were several large, feather-covered theropods. It was a pack of several large dinosaurs picking the last meat off a human's bloody corpse. A corpse that was too small to be a full meal for the sheer number of dinosaurs at that size by itself. Ross's eyes widened as several heads turned to look in his directions, and the dinosaurs stood upright as they spotted him, their green eyes locking on him. Some just stared. One tilted its head almost completely sideways as it was looking at him. Not in a curious way, but rather in a way that it was clearly thinking about if Ross was worth chasing. And one gulped down a bit of torn flesh hanging from its mouth with a snort and began sniffing. Ross didn't know it, but he was looking at a pack of large dromaeosaurs, specifically a pack of 7 large achillobators. The achillobators, a species of raptor much like the one from his nightmare long ago, had scaly skin which was light tan and gray mix. The skin was hidden beneath a thick covering of feathers. The feathers covering each of their bodies were brownish-red colored with gray speckles. The feathers formed a thick coat on each dinosaur and didn't leave many scales exposed, except for on the lower and inner legs, hands past the wrists and belly, along with the underside of the tail and on their snouts. Their faces were similar looking to the one Ross had seen back on the road. The uncanny forward-facing eyes were the same, but these ones were much larger than the one Ross had seen earlier. And you could see the intelligence in each of their eyes. The thinking mind of the dromaeosaurs had, which was fully devoted to him at that moment, likely thinking about if they could eat him too, like the poor soul they'd just finished off. The one with its head cocked to the side seemed especially focused on thinking about him. Ross didn't know a thing about the dinosaurs he was looking at. He didn't know hardly anything about prehistoric animals at all. Only thing he knew for sure was that these were an obvious threat. They were the largest animals he'd ever seen in person. But he didn't realize that the dinosaurs were in fact much larger than ones of their species ought to have been. They were easily taller and much longer than even a polar bear, the largest animal Ross had ever seen in person. In fact, compared to the raptors now beginning to stalk towards him, with feathers flashing in threat displays, the polar bears seemed small in comparison. A chilobator was a large bipedal, heavily built carnivore with a deadly sickle claw on the second toe of each foot. Compared to other dromaeosaurs, the chilobators had shorter arms, but they were still one of the largest dinosaurs in the entire genus, dwarfing the iconic velociraptor. Normal chilobators were easily tall enough to look an average human right in the eye, but the ones in this pack were tall enough to do that with a pack of large Utah raptors. But Ross didn't know enough to spot these oddities that would have made a paleo expert pause. Snapping out of his surprise, Ross revved the engine and attempted to turn away and drive away from the theropods, but he put too much gas into the engine too quickly and attempted to turn too quickly as well. The result was him popping into an unexpected wheelie that caused him to lose balance and fall backwards off the scooter, which crashed down next to him. Lying on top of his bags in the middle of the intersection now, Ross scrambled into a sitting position to see the raptors closing in on him, with some individuals in the pack breaking off and approaching from the sides to box him in. There were 8 of them, not 7, slowly walking closer to him, their claws clicking softly on the asphalt with each step the dinosaurs took. One stopped and cocked its head to the side again, looking at him and very clearly thinking about him for a moment before letting out a chirping bark at its fellows, and they hissed in unison, closing in with more confidence now. Now scrambling into a sitting position, Ross unholstered his service weapon and aimed the pistol at the one that had crept nearest to him. The dinosaur, the closest to Ross's right, hissed as he raised the gun, and Ross fired twice in close succession. He shot the dinosaur in the lower neck both times, and he scrambled to his feet as it collapsed, and he started running to the left, back in the direction he'd come from. The scooter he left still running in the middle of the raptors. The pack shrieked as their fellow dropped onto the street, and with enraged snarls, they sprinted around the street corner and after their fleeing prey. Ross could hear their footsteps slamming on the pavement and their claws sticking on the ground, coming nearer with each second, no matter how fast he sprinted. "Oh shit!" he said, not stopping or looking back. As they rapidly gained the little ground he had gained on them by running, he considered dumping his bags to lose the weight and bolting for a nearby car or fenced-off alley. Just then, a metal door on the building he was passing, the same building that had prevented him from being able to see what was around the corner at the intersection, was pulled open with a scraping sound. "Quick, in here!" a voice from an unseen person shouted. Ross paused for just a moment to consider it before bolting for it, the dinosaurs now right on his heels. He sprinted off the street and dove through the door and into the dim room behind it. Once inside, he threw himself into the door and slammed it shut again, sliding a bolt lock on the door into place after doing so. He managed to lock the door as one of the raptors outside collided with it with such force that he was thrown back several steps. Stumbling back up, gasping deeply, Ross watched with wide eyes as the doorknob began turning as the dinosaurs outside tried to open it. "What?" he thought, now very thankful that he had locked it. Couldn't help but stare at the turning knob for a moment. It was the last thing he would have ever expected. Only then remembering that he wasn't alone in the building. Ross turned away from the door to look for who had opened it, and found himself staring down the barrel of a pistol, which was aimed directly at his face. Ross stiffened, keeping his hands out at his side, and the person with the gun, a young Caucasian man, pushed him back against the wall, then took his bag and service weapon from his hand. The young man didn't seem to be the most familiar with firearms, because it took him a second to realize that he hadn't pulled the hammer on the pistol back yet, and he hastily corrected that as more people appeared from behind him out of the gloom. Each held a weapon of some kind, but Ross only saw one other gun, another pistol. Everyone else in the group held makeshift weapons, mostly consisting of cuts of metal pipe. The dimly illuminated room itself felt like a big space, and was likely a storage facility of some sort. The young man holding the gun in Ross's face seemed to be the youngest of the group. He looked to be around a decade younger than the officer, likely in his mid-20s. The second person Ross saw was a woman, the only one in the group, and she was closer to his own age. Behind her was a large, well-built Latino man, wearing dark clothes, who Ross hadn't noticed in the gloom of the room at first. The man was so well-built and muscular that Ross would have bet in a scenario where he was given something like a metal rod, or just the pipe he was holding, and told to fight one of the raptors outside in a one-on-one fight, the big man would probably be able to win. The other people in the group, there were 6 in total, were a mix of ages, but all also Caucasian, save for one additional Latino man, who was much less muscularly built and younger than looking than the first. He looked to be around the same age as the young man who was pointing the gun at Ross. No one in the group appeared to be younger, and no one in the group appeared to be older than maybe their mid-40s. One individual near the back of the group seemed to have some authority, because he stood with his arms crossed until Ross's bags were handed to him, and then he stood in silence and watched the newcomer. He was a well-built man, with black hair, and appeared to be around 30, and was slightly taller than the officer he was glaring at. The young man pointing the pistol at Ross's face didn't remove the gun or look away from him, but started talking over his shoulder to the others in the group as they began discussing Ross. "Why the hell did you open that door? They almost got inside. If that guy had been a second later on closing it, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Unless it was from inside their stomachs," the man who seemed to be the leader shouted. The young man looked at him over his shoulder. "I opened the door because them catching him out in the street wouldn't have changed our situation. But in here, maybe we can use him," he explained. Ross started to open his mouth, but the young man shoved the gun barrel practically inside his mouth. "Shut up," he said. "Use him how?" the girl asked. "Easy. Toss him to the raptors. Maybe out the door that leads to the alley on the other side of the street, and then we can make a break for the trucks and get out of here. That would put the raptors on another street, so we'd have a few seconds. The young man looked at the others and continued. Look, we don't know this guy from Adam. We owe him nothing. Our group, our people, and getting back to them matters more than a guy who just drove into town on a scooter. He could be anyone for all we know. The group seemed considerate, each making eye contact and sharing a silent, contemplative look. I think it's clear at this point they're not going away. They've been circling the building and trying to find a way inside since they chased us in here yesterday. We're lucky they haven't realized this building is connected to that store on the opposite street, or they'd be able to easily come at us by busting out the front windows, the woman eventually said. She's not wrong, one of the other members of the group said, a young man with blonde hair. Those things are some of those talking ones, too. They're smart enough to know we can't get out of here. They'll starve us out if we don't do something, or if they don't find a way in. The big Latino man nodded and smacked the metal pipe he was holding in his palm lightly, as if he was ready to whack the stranger over the head with it and toss him out onto the street. Hey, Ross started, but he was cut off again. I told you to shut up, the young man said, and keep your hands up by your head. Okay, Ross complied, but just hear me out for a second. If you're really thinking about feeding me to those things, then the polite thing to do is at least let me talk first. We don't owe you anything, officer, the big Latino man said. Just hear me out for a second, Ross protested, managing to speak despite having a pistol basically shoved into his mouth. All right, the leader said, raising a hand and taking a few steps forward. The blond man glared now, crossing his arms, and he went silent, sulking and looking like he'd already made up his mind on what to do. The leader, who seemed to be wanting to hear all options before making his choice, stepped forward, and Ross could make out some of the details about him. His gray shirt was sweat-stained. He was built heavier and sporting a light stubble on his face, and he had a no-nonsense look on his face so well-defined that Ross wondered what this guy had already done to get by in the apocalypse. Despite looking like he'd be willing to throw a stranger to hungry dinosaurs himself, he also didn't give off the aura of a bad person, which was something Ross knew how to recognize from his years as a cop. Instead, he saw the man was willing to give him a fair chance. You tell us what's better than just tossing you out the back door, making a run for our trucks after they go after you, outrunning the dinosaurs while they eat you, and getting back to our group all alive and well, the leader said. Ross steadied his nerves and spoke. Look, I can't promise not doing that will give you a better result. But what if we try something else that has the same outcome for you either way? The man looked intrigued, so Ross continued. Something where you get back to your group either way, and I'll still be the one in danger, not you. But this way also gives me a fair fighting chance. Let me try to get you all out of here. You said you've been stuck here all day? Well, sometimes you just need a fresh perspective to see a way out. If I can, then we all get away. If not, you can do it your way. I won't fight you over it. The leader mulled Ross's words over and slowly nodded. All right. We'll give you a fair chance to find a way for all of us to get out of here. But if you can't figure something out, we'll throw you to the wolves. If you do come up with something, great. Heck, we'll even let you join us if it works, he said with a snort. This time, Ross slowly nodded. Deal, he agreed. Either way, you win in this. Okay. Remember, if it comes to it, you get fed to the dinosaurs first, and we make a run for it, the leader said, patting the young man on the shoulder. Lower the gun, pal. Let's see what the good officer here can figure out. Come on, cop. We're going up to the roof. With the condition of being fed to the dinosaurs, if he couldn't find a way to get the group out of their tight spot hanging over his head, Ross maintained his calm, on-duty attitude as he stepped out onto the roof. Thanks to his police training, he didn't panic quickly in a high-tense situation, but even still, he had never been in such an instance where the threat to his life was so high from so many points. Emerging from the door of the stairwell that led up to the roof, Ross followed the group's leader to the edge and looked down at the street below. His hand went instinctively to his holster when he saw what was waiting on the street below, but it was empty. It had momentarily slipped his mind that the group had taken all of his supplies from him. Circling below was a chilling sight. The large, feather-covered forms of the dinosaurs were waiting down on the street, their gazes looking up at the people on the roof. Though they were 2 stories above the ground, Ross swore he could see the gleams in the dinosaurs' glaring eyes. At first, they'd been mingling about. Then one had looked up, spoke, and the others all did the same, coming together and stopping right below the group. They looked like menacing dark shapes as they stood well within the building's now long shadow. Faint sounds of chittering echoed up from the street below as the dinosaurs squawked at each other. They seemed to have no issues going back and forth from speech to squawks or other vocalizations. Though no one on the roof could hear it, the dinosaurs were indeed speaking. With her teeth bared, the pack's alpha glared up at the silhouetted shape of Ross on the roof above her, able to make him out since he was the only one wearing a hat. "That new one is mine. You can have the others. I don't care how you divide them up. But I want him all to myself," she said, audibly tapping one of her sickle claws on the asphalt in agitation. "I'll cut his eyes out, too. As a start!" She snarled with venom in her voice, rage simmering from one of her packmates being shot and killed. Some of the feathers on her head and neck rose in agitation as she spoke, never looking away from the stranger who had killed one of her own. She continued looking up at the deputy for several minutes, her gaze focused and eyes unblinking. She parted her jaws. "I want him. He is mine," she thought, finger claws flexing and sickle claws tapping on the ground. She was having sadistically lustful thoughts about everything she would do to the new person once she caught him. He would regret interfering with their hunt and then killing one of their own. They hadn't been planning on killing him at first. Instead, they were planning to scare him away so the people inside the building wouldn't have a chance to get the weapons Ross had been carrying. That had changed when he'd opened fire, and now the Alpha was only seeing red. This wasn't part of the hunt. This was simply vengeance and reckoning. Stepping forward, still looking up at the people on the roof, the Alpha Raptor squawked. The others all did the same in unison and turned their collective gazes back up to the people on the roof as well. The effect of their chorus was a single, magnified, squawking bark which echoed down the streets. Looking down at the street, Ross didn't like what he saw and glanced to each side. The others were standing on each side of him, also looking down at the street with grim or unreadable expressions on their faces. Ross adjusted his hat. "What are your names?" he asked. "You don't need to worry about that right now. You might not know us much longer if you don't come up with anything soon," the leader replied, not looking at him, but instead down at the street. "Hey, I'm a cop. I protect and serve people. I still want to despite all this. I'd like a little decency in return, at least," Ross said, looking back down at the street. "How'd you get trapped up here anyway?" "We're part of a group of 14, someone else answered, the young man Ross had first interacted with. He looked away from the dinosaurs and over at Ross before continuing. "About half of us came here on a supply run, the other half stayed back at camp. We were coming here to this building when those things came out of nowhere. They ambushed us from an alley while we were on the street, trying to get that door I opened for you unchained. We just got inside and locked the door, and we've been here since." "That's been a day ago now," the young man said. Ross nodded slightly after a moment. Some of the carnivores seem to have adapted well to hunting in urban areas like this. My town had a few show up throughout the winter, he said, before walking away from the edge and over to the other side of the building and looking down at the street he'd first seen the raptors on. The young man followed him, and Ross gazed down at the gory scene he'd seen on the street. Who'd the motorcycle belong to? It's not parked with the rest of your vehicles, Ross asked. One member of our group. He just parked around the corner, the young man said. Yeah, it's the guy they were eating. A little while ago, he tried to sneak out of the side door, back down onto the street, and through that alley down there. He was going to get on the bike and try to lead the raptors away so we could get to the trucks. He made too much noise on opening that chain-link door at the end of the alley, and they were all over him in seconds. He pointed to the spot. A side door of the building opened into an alley, and at the end of the alley was a chain fence, much taller than a person, with a chain-link door which could be opened to allow access to the street. The door was open now, and the mutilated, eaten corpse was not far from it, close to the motorcycle. Ross wondered if the man had tried to run back to the alley when he was attacked. They made a show of it, the young man spoke again, when they caught him. They made a show of making sure that we saw everything they did to him. They ate the non-vital parts first. They went layer by layer of skin, and at one, they only killed him once everything they could eat that wouldn't kill him was eaten. At one point, they even gouged his eyes out and tried to make him guess what part was next now that he couldn't see what they were doing. One of them, the one who seems to be the alpha, kept giving him 3 guesses before she'd do whatever she was thinking. If he guessed right, she didn't cut that part of him right away. They'd just move on to the next. It was the most sadistic thing I've ever seen. I guess after a while, she got sick of it because she and the others just started eating him alive. She kept looking back up here to make sure we were still watching. Thankfully, we locked that side door again before they could think to try opening it. Ross didn't respond for a moment before he turned to look at the young stranger. So the motorcycle is down there, and the rest of your vehicles... 2 trucks, the young man said. Yeah, 2 trucks. Are around the corner? Right across the street from that door I opened for you. So, good distance between them, Ross mumbled, looking thoughtful. He bit his lip, thoughtful, as a crazy idea began formulating in his mind. Having had enough, the leader came over. Well, you coming up with something? He asked, the rest of the group following. Ross slowly nodded. Yeah, starting to, he replied. The raptors on the street are by your trucks right now. They're nowhere close to the motorcycle or even in view of it. The leader glanced over the edge at the motorcycle on the street below. So, your point? Look, your guy tried to slip out of the alley to it to draw them off. But he made too much noise opening that gate down there. But it's open now. And since the bike is right outside of it, and around the corner from the raptors, I want to try the same thing, Ross said. I'll get on the bike, make a whole lot of noise, and draw them off. When they chase me, you can make a run for the vehicles. And everyone gets a fighting chance. You can see how well that idea worked before, the leader replied. The gate is open now. I can squeeze past it without bumping it. And if I don't have to open it more, it won't make any noise, and I can slip onto the street unnoticed. The leader looked unconvinced and unimpressed, but the young man unexpectedly came to Ross's side and voiced his support. That could work, he said. Achillobators aren't like, say, Dakota raptors. They're fast, but they can't run at full speed for very long. If you can get onto that motorcycle and keep ahead of them long enough to tire them out, you can outrun them. Same thing on our end. We get to the trucks and we can outrun them easily given enough time. We can't go at full speed on the streets because of the debris, but once we're outside, it's all open road. Okay, fair point. But you're forgetting one important part, the leader conceded. To drive the bike, you need the key, and it's down there, he added, pointing at the corpse. He had the keys when he got eaten. You're gonna have to look through that mess to find the key and hope it's in there somewhere and also wasn't eaten. Ross nodded in acceptance. Won't be the first body I've handled lately. For the last few months, I was trying to catch a serial killer who used acid to melt his victims. It doesn't bother me much anymore. It'll be the first without gloves, though, he said, muttering the last part with a grimace. Well, again, you just better hope they didn't eat the key, too, the leader said. Of course, if they did, you should be able to still get it, considering the other part of our deal. I'm sure you'll join them quickly enough and find which raptor ate them. Ross didn't reply to that. He kept his face stony and didn't give a response. The leader turned to walk back to where he could see the raptors, and Ross turned when the young man patted his shoulder. Is he always like that? Ross asked. The young man shrugged. He just doesn't trust you. He responded with a shrug of his own, which then turned to a slightly grossed out look on his face. Your plan is really to go down there and hope you don't make a sound and search the body for the key, while also hoping it didn't get eaten as well. I also gotta lift up that bike, turn it on, and start driving it before they catch me, Ross replied, not looking like he liked the odds he had of pulling that idea off. I don't even know how to drive one of those things. I hope it's similar to that scooter I was driving. A lot of things had to go right that could easily go wrong in order for him to survive the next few minutes. He then looked back at the group's leader and called out, Look, either way this goes, you'll have time to get away while they're distracted. But I will try to do this. I know the world is a mess right now, but helping people really is something I still want to do, and you guys look like you need it. I'll drive the raptors off on the bike. You just be ready to drive out of here, too. And what are you gonna do when you drive away with them after you? The man asked. Ross shook his head. Try to outrun them? Maybe take out a few if I can, he said. I just have to hope the key is in the corpse and not one of the raptors. The man still looked unconvinced, but he reached into his back pocket and pulled out Ross's service pistol, which he handed back to the deputy. You're gonna need this then, he said. We'll set you up with one of the rifles too. Ross nodded. Make sure it's one of the ones with the strap, he said, checking the pistol, seeing it still had all the bullets left in the clip that he hadn't shot. Making sure one was still in the chamber, he then slid the weapon back into its holster. The leader took a rifle from Ross's bag and loaded it. Look, here's some advice you should keep in mind. You're a cop, so I'm sure you saw your share of the bullshit these last few months. But this anomaly, or whatever you want to call it, that caused said bullshit, it spread around like a virus. And every virus has its variants. Each variant is different, and as you can see, not all the animals are quite as they should be. Likewise, some of those talking ones that showed up are more dangerous than others. Just be sure to expect the unexpected. I'm sure those on the street and others like them have more secrets hidden up their feathery hides than we know. And if you somehow survive, get out of the city before dark. You don't want to be in the city after dark. Do I want to know the reason? Ross asked. No. If you don't get eaten down there, you'll sleep better tonight not knowing what comes out around here at night. We just need to be gone by nightfall, the leader replied, handing the rifle over. With Ross leading the way down, the group descended the stairs back into the large, dimly illuminated building. "What was this place?" Ross asked. "You said you were coming here, so you must know." The young man chuckled and simply replied, "The dungeon." "What?" Ross asked. The young man snorted. A slight smirk spread across his face. "Storage," he clarified. "The store I worked at, the one they kept mentioning, is attached to this building, and we kept all of our stock here. But there were no working lights, so we had to walk around back here with lanterns. So we called it the dungeon. I suggested we come here because I didn't think anyone else would know about it or think to check here. But the place was already cleaned out, so I was wrong. Probably my manager's doing." "So, what were you looking for?" Ross asked. The young man shook his head. "Food. There were totes upon totes of canned food and just add water meals. And whatever medical supplies or medicine we could find. Water, too. There were thousands of cases back here. It's all gone, though, so this was just a wasted effort." Before Ross could respond, the group's leader shoved his way between them, and his glare told Ross the conversation was over. "Talking time is over. It's time to get to it, officer. We gotta move before they try to break inside again." "He'll show you where the door to the alley is," the leader said, nodding to the young man. Ross nodded. "Right," he said. Just for future reference, you don't have to be a hard ass all the time to show people you're tough. You care about your people. And anyone can tell you mean business. That's enough to keep anyone who has common sense from wanting to mess with you." The leader snorted. "I ain't a hard ass to my people. Just outsiders." "Just give it some thought," Ross replied, making sure the rifle was loaded and ready to be fired. Once he was satisfied, he slung it over his shoulder and nodded. The young man guided Ross to the side door that led out into the alley. They stopped outside of it, and Ross's guide sighed. "Sorry about probably sending you to your death here. You seem like a nice guy. And the gun, too. Sorry about the gun to the face." Ross nodded and sighed as well. "Well, if you hadn't opened the door, I probably would be dead already. At least now I got a fighting chance." He offered a small, friendly smile, and the two shook hands. "Hey, if you do get through this, I think you'll fit in well and be useful. And don't worry about him. He'll back off if you pull this off." The young man then placed a hand on the doorknob. "A little tip. You're gonna have to be quick. I hope you were an Olympic runner." Ross pointed to his badge. "Sheriff's deputy, actually," he said. The young man shrugged. "Well, I hope you weren't the donut-loving cop." "I hope he was," the big Latino man suddenly said, who seemed to have followed the two but stayed hidden just in the gloom. "More of him for the raptors to eat means the more time for us to make a run for the trucks." "Thanks for that," Ross sarcastically replied, unslinging the rifle and holding it at the ready. The young man nodded to him. "Save a bullet just for yourself. Just in case," he said, and slowly pulled the door open just enough for Ross to squeeze out past it. Golden sunlight streaked into the room like a beam of golden glowing yellow. As he prepared himself to step outside the door and, in all likelihood, all but right into the waiting jaws of the dinosaurs, Ross thought to himself that no matter the outcome of what happened in the next few minutes, at least he'd be able to actually do something to help, protect, and serve people one more time. If he lived through this and got to join them, he'd be able to keep doing so, but if he died here in the city, he'd die knowing he'd do what he'd sworn to do one final time. And that a group of people who seemed like overall fine but scared and cautious folk would get going and get to have a second chance. With that in mind, Ross ducked down and slipped out through the door. He half crouched outside with the rifle ready, turning back once he heard the door be pushed closed again and locked. Taking a deep breath to calm his nerves, Ross stood and slowly walked down the alley, gun raised and keeping silent. The chain link fence at the end of the alley drew nearer, and Ross had to put the rifle back over his shoulder to squeeze through the open gate. His badge brushed against it, and the fence made a soft jingle, but nothing more than it would have made in a soft gust of wind. It still made his heart skip a beat. Squeezing past without a problem, Ross stepped out onto the sidewalk and looked both ways. No raptors were in sight, and everything was still. In fact, a little too still for the deputy's liking. With the street clear, though, he stepped further away from the alley, but stopped before reaching the corpse. A further look around again confirmed no raptors were anywhere in sight. So, Ross crouched down by the body. It was a gory sight up close. The flesh and muscles were almost all eaten and picked away, though bite-sized chunks still clung to the bones. Organs that weren't eaten were lying on the road beside the body or still in its belly. The skull barely had any meat left on it, and its eye sockets were clearly gouged by claws. Its gore-coated jaw hung open from the man's final scream, and had enough flesh left on it to hold the jaw to the skull. Setting his rifle down by the body and covering his mouth, Ross first patted down the shredded pants on the body, but the keys were nowhere in the belt or in the pockets. They weren't in either hand either, or lying nearby. Knowing there was every chance one of the dinosaurs had eaten them and ruined the only chance he had, Ross decided to take a chance after spotting part of the man's belt lying in the torn flesh and organs inside the lower stomach of the corpse, and he plunged his hand into the gore. It was still warm, and everything that was human was soft, to the point it made him feel queasy. Ross had dealt with and handled multiple bodies throughout his career, more within the last year than ever after the serial killer became active, but this one was by far the worst. Even the Reaper's most mutilated victim, or rather most melted, since his method of removing forensic evidence was melting the bodies with acid, wasn't as stomach-turning as the one Ross now had his hand inside of. The only upside was that, with everything other than the bones he felt being soft and squishy, the metallic, smooth keys instantly stood out when his hand brushed against them. Keeping a cheer back, Ross grasped each key tightly within his fist to prevent them jingling, and pulled the keys out of the corpse, thankful they had indeed ended up inside the body rather than inside one of the dinosaurs' stomachs. Not about to be caught while distracted by standing up and figuring out how to turn on the bike, he moved back closer to the building wall and approached the corner he'd driven around and into his current predicament. His scooter was still lying on the street, engine still idling, but Ross ignored it. Even if all he had to do was stand it up and ride away, the motorcycle would be faster. Plus, it was in the middle of the intersection and in full view of each of the streets that it met. Pressing his body up against the building wall, Ross peeked around the corner, leaning forward just enough for one eye to get a view of the street. He needed to see where the raptors were. The last thing he needed was one of them to wander around the corner while he was trying to start the bike. The first thing he saw was their white teeth gleaming, reflecting the bright yellow light of the late afternoon sun. Able to see the raptors without them bearing down on him, Ross was taken aback by just how massive they were. He also saw the feathers on their tails and arms were the longest, and the plumage coating them across their bodies was thick all over, save for on their snouts, underside, bellies, lower legs. Simply put, the raptors were massive. Seeing them sitting still really let it strike Ross just how big the dromaeosaurs were. They easily were tall enough to look a person right in the eyes, maybe even tall enough to look down at some people. They were standing still, together in a circle, facing inwards towards the center, talking amongst themselves, and Ross was reminded about the leader's variant comments. Slowly, the deputy pulled his head back behind the wall so that he was out of sight of the raptors, though he could make out the words the pack's alpha was saying about him. Ross felt some bile rise in his throat at her words, and his hand went to his pistol instinctively as he slowly backed off towards the bike, listening as she discussed all the horrifying things she was planning to do to him once she finally got her claws into him. Ross turned away and hurried back to the bike as silently as he could. And keeping silent as possible, Ross slowly stood the motorcycle up. It was bulky and heavier than it looked, and he nearly dropped it. Standing and balancing it without it scraping the ground also proved to be much harder than he expected. Then, he slowly set himself down on the seat and retrieved the gore-splattered keys from his pocket, moving them slow so they didn't jingle, which was hard when he had to switch hands. Ross had to fidget and try more than one before he found the one that fit into the ignition. When he did, it slid right into the key slot with an audible snap and a soft jingle of the keys. Looking at the corner with wide eyes, Ross relaxed slightly after a few seconds when no feathered heads appeared around the corner. And as soon as he turned the key, Ross knew that the jig was up, though, because the engine let out a tentative rev as power flowed into it. Though he couldn't see them, the deputy could vividly picture the dinosaurs all snapping their heads around to face his direction, maybe one or two of them cocking their heads, but most likely staring with hyper-focused eyes. And that mental image, along with the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the corner after a moment, was all he needed to motivate him to turn the key again as the engine had stalled the first time. This time, it roared fully to life, and he kicked the bike into gear and sped down the street. A glance over his shoulder told him that his guess had been right, as Ross saw that 4 of the large dinosaurs had sprinted around the corner and were following him at a full sprint, the alpha leading them. Her eyes bore a murderous glare. To say they were fast would undersell their speed. Each time one of them slammed their feet into the pavement, the preceding stride carried the dinosaur forward, the length of an average human's height easily. They were so fast that they were closing the distance between them. Giving the bike more gas, Ross turned around and sped up, driving further into the city with half the pack right behind him. Almost close enough to bite the axle, if they so wished. Okay. Go! The group's leader shouted, faintly hearing the bike drive away. Tearing the metal door open, causing a loud scrape, he motioned the others out and followed them as they sprinted out and across the street to their trucks. They'd only just reached the 2 vehicles when 3 raptors, which hadn't chased after Ross, suddenly appeared, having hidden themselves out of sight near the trucks to wait for an ambush. Shit! The group's leader shouted as the dromaeosaurs charged out of an alley near the trucks, shrieking at their prey. The leader fired one shot from the rifle he was holding, which missed, before diving into the open driver's side door of the lead truck. He stuck the keys into the ignition, and the vehicle roared to life as one of the raptors leapt onto the roof. Stomping on the gas, he pulled the vehicle out onto the street with an excess amount of swerve, throwing the raptor from the roof into the sidewalk. The unbuckled passengers in the vehicle were also thrown into each other. Behind them, the second vehicle also roared to life and sped up to the first. The 3 raptors, the one who was thrown had already jumped back onto its feet, followed right behind them at a full sprint. Meanwhile, Ross still had the alpha and the 3 others right on his heels, or his rear brakes. They hadn't slowed their pursuit at all and instead seemed to be only pushing themselves to run even faster. Glancing back over his shoulder, he could see the determination in the dinosaur's eyes, especially that of the raptor alpha at the head of the pack. Facing forward again, Ross spotted a sign above an approaching intersection and made a sharp turn to the left. He slowed greatly as he did, but he had just enough of a lead on the dinosaurs to make the turn and speed up again before they could catch him, though they were now right behind him, the nearest in snapping distance. Each also gracefully made the turn around the street corner without slowing. Ross didn't sacrifice what little lead he had for no reason, though. He made the turn so he could lead the raptors to a place that he could possibly use against them. Possibly. A few blocks later, Ross emerged from the forest of skyscrapers. He had led the dinosaurs across an overpass, and from there, down and out over a long bridge crossing the Ohio River. The bridge was long, and he wasn't sure which specific one it was, but Ross had a reason for leading the raptors here. Maneuvering the bike over to the side of the bridge, he slowed, just enough to see if he could get one of the raptors to jump at him now that they were nearly on top of him. The two closest ones took the bait and leapt at him, jaws gaping and reaching out with their claws. Ross sped up again, and the two raptors flew behind him, sailing right over the guardrail and falling, shrieking down into the river below, with a combined splash so loud he could hear it over the roaring engine of his bike. Ross gasped from the strain of keeping his cool, but he steadied himself, a result of years of having to keep his cool under pressure, and he unslung the shotgun from his back. The two remaining raptors were easily keeping pace with the motorcycle, and as the nearest raptor put on a new burst of speed and began to close the distance between them, jaws opening to snap at him, Ross again took his eyes off the road and stuffed the gun barrel down the raptor's throat. The dinosaur's eyes bulged and it bit down on instinct, while a gurgled growl of surprise emitted from its throat as Ross pulled the trigger. The back of the dinosaur's head disintegrated as the bullet passed through its skull, bits of bone, feathers, brain matter, and even one of its eyes flying out into the air behind it. As its head was blown apart, the raptor's legs gave out and it tumbled to the ground and rolled over itself into a tangled mess of limbs. Unfortunately, though it wasn't expected, the dinosaur's jaws were still clamped on the rifle barrel and it was ripped from Ross's grip. Now, only armed with his service pistol, Ross grasped its grip to ensure that it was still firmly in its holster. As he did, he spared another moment to look at the remaining raptor, the Alpha, and saw that she was finally beginning to slow down. Her sides were heaving with each breath, though now she looked more enraged than ever. Satisfied, Ross turned to face forward again and put more gas into the engine, putting more distance between himself and his pursuer. He realized that the comparison to cheetahs was correct. They couldn't sprint at a full speed forever. Ross knew that if he could outrun the dinosaur, or at least run it to exhaustion, he'd be able to take her out as well. He further increased his speed, and the raptor did the same, keeping close behind him despite her growing exhaustion. Ross finished crossing the bridge and drove at the fastest speed he was willing to risk, back into the forest of empty skyscrapers. The Achillobator Alpha was right behind him the whole time, putting in so much speed to her legs that they were becoming a blur, and keeping so close behind him that she could taste the exhaust from the bike. The look in her eyes had only grown more manic. They looked like an unhinged version of the cold eyes Ross had seen in the serial killer he and Vincenzo had been trying to catch. Those weren't the eyes of a carnivorous dinosaur on the hunt. Those were the eyes of something which killed for enjoyment, Ross realized. The two trucks swerved down the road, dodging abandoned and wrecked cars or other vehicles. Despite the obstacles and constant swerving, they were able to drive fast enough to keep ahead of the three raptors chasing them. Sitting in the driver's seat of the second truck was the blonde woman. Sitting in the passenger seat next to her was the young man, and in the back behind them was the smaller Latino man. He was digging through the bag of guns Ross had been carrying, saying, "Let's see what guns the cop had." As he opened it, he was pleasantly surprised. "Shit, this guy was packing the real stuff," he excitedly called out, pulling out a powerful pump-action shotgun from the bag and loading several shells into it. The young man took his eyes off the raptors in the mirror and looked back. "Oh, that stuff is way better than most of what we have at camp," he agreed. With the pump-action shotgun loaded, the man in the back turned around, slid open the back window, and leaned outside. Pumping once to make sure the gun was ready to fire, he leveled it at the nearest Achillobator. Despite the awkward arrangement, and even with the truck swerving, he managed to aim straight and fired at the dinosaur. The spread that fired from the barrel shredded the dinosaur's face and neck apart, and it dropped to the pavement instantly, rolling over its own limp limbs. The Achillobator sprinting behind it jumped over the corpse with a chittering squawk, flapping its feather-covered arms like wings for a moment, and then it landed mid-stride and continued sprinting after the truck. Its fangs bared into a snarl, and it bore a murderous glare in its intelligent eyes. The third Achillobator also jumped over the corpse mid-stride and kept the chase up without slowing down, its feet slamming onto the pavement in blurred flashes. Prehistory? Meet the pump action, the man said, pointing the gun up and pumping it again. You're not ready for this. He again lowered it and fired at the nearest Achillobator, but he didn't see the almost smile on its lips as he aimed. As soon as he squeezed the trigger and fired, the nearest of the two raptors ducked underneath the shot and sprung forward from the squatting position with a powerful jump, doing so with such efficiency and speed that it didn't lose any ground. It landed on the closed tailgate of the truck and dangled off the back of the vehicle for a moment. Within seconds, it scrambled up into the back of the pickup's bed. With a shriek, it latched its jaws onto the shotgun's barrel before the man could fire again. He'd been so surprised by the dinosaur dodging the shot that he hadn't even snapped out of his brief shot long enough to pump the gun up again. The dinosaur tore the gun from the man's grasp with a powerful yank, and it nearly pulled him completely out of the back window and into the bed with it as it did. With the man laying at its feet, the raptor tossed the gun off to the side and looked down at him with a smile so wicked that it didn't have any business being on such a scary, inhuman face. It tapped its curved sickle claw on the metal bed in a taunting manner. The man gulped. You're scary smart, he whimpered as he met eyes with the dinosaur. It began to lean down towards him, its jaws just slightly parted, like it was going to kiss him. Meanwhile, in the passenger seat, the young man saw the whole thing play out. It happened so fast that at first he froze, before he shouted to the blonde woman, Swerve! Now! By a stroke of good luck, at that moment they were speeding towards an intersection. So, she cut the wheel hard to the right. As the other truck continued forward, the second, with a slight spin, turned onto the new street. The momentum threw the Achillobator off balance, and it went flying out of the back of the truck. The man which it had been about to maul managed to hang on and stayed anchored in the bed of the truck. He gasped once the truck straightened out and sighed in relief. He pushed himself back through the window and into the back seat. Thanks, he said, visibly shook. The driver nodded to him in the rearview mirror, and the young man looked in the mirror outside his window. One followed the other truck, and that one that was in the back is on its feet and following us again, he reported. I'm over these freaks, the driver muttered, looking in the mirror on her side. She began to speed the truck up and watched as the raptor began sprinting even faster to maintain its close pursuit. What are you doing? The young man asked. The woman held up her finger. I got this, she said. Put your seatbelts on, you two, or you are going to go flying. Looking alarmed, the two passengers quickly put their belts on and braced for whatever was coming. Continuing to bait the pursuing raptor, the woman slowly kept increasing the speed of the truck, staying in the middle of the street to avoid crashing into any of the wrecked cars or streetlights that dotted the sides. Come on, she silently urged. As the dinosaur put all its effort into the pursuit, the driver suddenly slammed on the brakes as hard as she could. The truck skidded to a stop nearly instantly, leaving burnt tire marks on the pavement, and everyone was thrown forward by the momentum until their seatbelts locked to hold them in place. The raptor squawked, but it was sprinting so fast and was so close that it couldn't stop in time. It skidded forward despite trying to slow itself, and then tumbled forward and slammed snout first into the tailgate at nearly the speed it had been sprinting at. It hit easily hard enough to crack the bones in its snout. As it tumbled down into a heap on the pavement, the driver put the truck in reverse and pressed on the gas as hard as she could. Creating smoke for a moment, the truck rocketed backwards and right over the raptor. There was another squawk, then the sound of bones and muscle being crushed, and several thumps as the vehicle drove over the dinosaur. She then put the vehicle in drive and did the same thing again, driving forward over the dinosaur's corpse for a second time to make sure it was dead. Prehistory? Meet the pickup, she said, looking at the two passengers with a smirk. He definitely wasn't ready for that. The young man looked like he'd seen his life flash before his eyes, but he nodded. So did the man in the back, still shaking from his close encounter with the dinosaur. The woman then pressed the pedal again and started driving forward, leaving the crushed body behind on the road. She took the first left they came to and started trying to loop around to find the others and help them with their pursuer if they needed it. The other truck, which contained the rest of the group, had not lost its pursuer yet. The pursuing Achillobator was relentless, putting all of its energy into maintaining its speed, pushing its body to its absolute limit. It was beginning to close the distance between them, its feet hitting the pavement so loud that it was audible through the closed windows, its large sickle claws a flashing blur each time it stepped. The leader was looking in his mirror as he drove through a three-way intersection when suddenly he saw another blurred shape come into view from the side and slam into the dinosaur. With a shriek, it was sent flying and it sailed into the large windows of a store, crashing through and vanishing inside the building. He slammed down the brake pedal and looked out of the back window to see what had happened. It was the second truck, its bumper a bashed-in tangle of metal. The other driver had slammed their vehicle into the Raptor as it passed through the intersection. The leader saw her give him the thumbs up. Nodding, he let off the brake and continued driving, the second truck following, and they sped away before the Raptor could recover from the impact and chase them again. The young man heard the smaller Latino man sigh in the back seat. "You okay?" he asked, concern on his face. The man nodded. "Yeah, I just never thought I'd get chased by something worse than a bull. Got too close to one while visiting my cousin's ranch once. Until today, that was the scariest thing I've ever gone through, but that animal had nothing on the raptor, especially the raptor's teeth." "You didn't get bit, right?" the young man asked. "No, I didn't. And I was about a second away from kissing the bride," the man replied, with a small laugh as he began to relax. The young man and blonde woman both laughed too, now able to since the situation was over and they'd finally escaped. "You would have made a lovely couple," she teased. "Yeah, I can't wait to see the kids," the young man added. The man in the back shuddered a little bit. "Ugh, thanks for that mental image," he said. "What, you didn't sense the spark?" the driver asked. The man in the back shook his head. "Too many claws, and too much of a threat of immediate death for my taste," he said, looking drained by the whole experience. Glancing back, Ross saw the Alpha Raptor still behind him, chasing him with the relentless determination of a heat-seeking missile that was armed with teeth and claws. She was breathing heavily, but not breaking her gaze even so much as to blink. Her entire focus was on catching up to him, but she could only push her body to keep her top sprinting speed up for so long. She did begin to fall behind, and then she fell further back. Ross let out the breath he hadn't been intending to hold in and turned the bike off the street he'd been driving on, and found that he had turned onto a dead-end street. He stopped, ahead only seeing a blank brick wall, the same on each side of him, and the only things in front of him was a dumpster and some empty cars. Ross slowly turned around to face the Alpha as he heard her heavy footsteps come around the corner and into the alley. She stood at the end of it, blocking his only way out. She ruffled her feathers and shook her head, the feathers on her neck raised like a wolf would raise its hackles. Her eyes locked onto his own, with a snarl spread across her snout, exposing each gleaming tooth she had inside her jaws. She wasn't, but it looked like she was smiling. The raptor was breathing hard, and foamy saliva was falling out of her jaws with each exhale. Ross turned the bike around to face her as she flexed her claws and took a step towards him. "You're mine," she hissed, sadism dripping from her voice just as thickly as the saliva dripping from her jaws was. She approached with heavy footsteps, claws tapping on the asphalt with each footfall, claws flexing in aggression, and feathers raised in a threatening manner. Ross began edging back towards the wall at the end of the street, keeping the distance between them the same. His hand went to his service weapon, and, while keeping an eye on the dinosaur out of the corner of his eye, not able to take his gaze off her, he ejected the clip to check how many bullets were left in the pistol. There were none in the clip, but he knew he hadn't fired them all either. Let's see. I have one bullet left, he said, sliding the clip back into the gun and flicking off the safety. Still straddling the idling bike, he turned his gaze back towards the raptor, which was still slowly walking towards him. With each step, her sickle claw lightly clicked on the asphalt, like the calling card of a serial killer. They stared at each other, into the eyes of one another, their eyes at the same height above the ground. For just a moment they were on equal footing. Ross had never seen a pair of eyes filled with so much sadism and rage that it was practically luminous within them. None of the other dinosaurs he had seen earlier that day had a sparkle in them remotely like it. It wasn't just the intelligence the raptor had. Before then, Ross had only seen that look in the eyes of some of the evilest humans he'd ever encountered on his job. Not even the most aggressive animals he'd ever encountered had eyes gleaming like the raptor's were. She continued to slowly creep closer to him, feathers still raised aggressively like hackles, her sickle claw flexing with each step, before she bolted and slipped out of his sight behind one of the abandoned cars. Ross raised his pistol and backed the bike up more, keeping it between him and her until he found himself against the wall at the end of the street. There were no doors to open, or fences to climb over, or fire escapes to scale. The walls around him were solid concrete, and the only way back out was ahead, past the raptor that he knew probably still had her eyes on him. Unlike the one he'd encountered on the road, this time he could not see her. He knew he could chance it and try to drive back out, gunning the engine as hard as he could, but she had ducked behind a car he'd have to maneuver around, placing herself in such a spot that she could keep his only way out blocked. If he tried to drive out, she'd lunge on him, and it would be over. Some of our talking kin might have befriended some of your kind, but that's not how the world should work. This is how it should work, human. The predator hunts and feeds on the weaker animal, the prey. Ross heard a tapping sound, the dinosaur's hand claws tapping against the side of the car door as she crouched out of sight behind the vehicle. To us, your kind are the weak animals, she added. That's what the voice in my head tells me you are. You blindly follow that inner voice, huh? Ross asked. What is that? Your primitive instincts speaking up? Or your true feelings? It's my own voice speaking, so I know it's one I can trust. Yeah, and saying you'll make me watch while you do all of these horrific things to me? Is that the way the natural world is supposed to go? Yeah, I heard that part. I don't think most carnivores do that when hunting. How about you explain that? The deputy said. Ross swore he could sense a sneer spreading out on the Chillabator's face. Might as well have some fun with being the superior creature, if you're able to appreciate being such a thing when you know you are, she replied, still crouched out of sight behind the vehicle, not even a single stray feather sticking out. Also, I think you've got a grudge against me because I shot one of your pack fellows. Is that how it's supposed to work? Is it not that the superior individual taking down the inferior one? If that's how you see everything, then I'd figure you'd appreciate me weeding out the weaker ones of your pack the way I did. Ross spat and the raptor suddenly darted out from behind the vehicle she'd been hiding behind in a flash of blurred feathers, and she hid behind a dumpster he was right next to. You know, you're smart. We're smart. You're imaginative as we are. If we actually work together, maybe we could make this world a good place for everyone instead of whatever it is you're playing. Don't deny it. There's plenty of your kind out there who are just like me, she replied. The ones who know their place compared to others and don't shy away from making that status known. Yeah. And you're reminding me of one of them. A serial killer I was trying to catch before all this happened. We don't take kindly to those kinds of people in our society, and I don't take kindly to being threatened by you. Being hunted by a hungry animal is one thing, but that's not what you are. You're just like him, the one I was trying to catch. And yet, you couldn't catch him. So, who really is the inferior one between us both? Human, she hissed, spitting the last word out in a clear message of disdain for what she saw as the weaker animal that didn't deserve to coexist in the same world as her species. Yeah, I didn't catch him, but I tried. That's what I do. I protect and serve others, and right now, you are what I need to protect others from, Ross said. With the raptor still out of sight, but just on the other side of the dumpster he was next to, Ross pulled the hammer on the pistol back. 1 bullet, he whispered under his breath. He had 1 bullet, so he had to make his one chance count. Grasping the gun tightly, he then spoke louder. You might be a threat, but you also care about your pack. I saw how angry you got after I killed the first one. I'll give you a one-time chance, right here and now, just between us. Walk out of this alley now and go away, and we all walk out of here. You can find the rest of your pack that flew off that bridge and live. Everyone goes their own way, and no one else dies. I never liked using a gun on a person, and I don't want to use it on any more of you, because I see you're as complex as any person. But if you don't take this offer, I will use it. Ross allowed the raptor a moment to consider his words before he spoke again. So, how about it? Do you want to live and have a second chance? Or do you die in this dead-end alley? Only you and me would ever know if you accept. The raptor didn't answer. The only sound was her claws ticking on the ground as she crouched lower to the ground, maybe for a spring. So Ross pressed his lips into a grim line and shook his head before placing his bait. Fine. Guess I can't change your mind. And you're between me and my only way out. And I don't think 1 bullet from this little pistol is enough to take you down. You know what? Since it's clear I won't change your mind, I think I'll use this 1 bullet on myself and not give you the satisfaction of killing me. Enjoy eating a corpse you can't torture first. Ross then pointed his pistol upward and placed his hand on the trigger. His training from the police academy came back to him. Bring the pistol up to your eye and only pull the trigger when you have to, and when you know the discharge will strike the target, his old trainer had said. So he waited. I'm not about to let another Reaper stay loose on the world, Ross thought as he aimed the gun. He couldn't catch one killer, but this one would not get away. Upon hearing his words, they prompted the dinosaur to action. The exhausted raptor crouched all the way down and sprung, not about to be robbed of the satisfaction of dragging this man's fate out after such a long chase and costly day. With a shriek, she flew over the dumpster, arms extended and jaws agape. The attack was sloppy and rushed, in total contrast to the cold and efficient hunter the group had first encountered. And as she sailed over the dumpster, she flew right into Ross's sight and the sight at the end of his pistol. He fired his single bullet. It sailed through the air and up into the raptor's upper jaw. and continued through the bone and up into her brain. She tumbled down onto the asphalt with a heavy flop and lay dead, sprawled in a heap of extended limbs, with blood dripping from her open mouth and onto the ground. Ross sighed as the tension in his muscles drained away, and he lowered his arms. He regarded the body, now a mere shell with no life in it, though it was still warm from the life that had flowed in it just seconds before. He shook his head. "What a waste," he muttered. "It's too bad that group, my group, and your pack, probably could have done some good things together if you weren't like this. Especially if that comment about some of you guys befriending people is true. I'm sorry this had to happen. You probably loved your pack as much as that group loves each other. No one won here." He didn't know if he was talking to himself, or to the Alpha, or to the universe. But either way, he viewed everything that had happened as a tragedy. So many were dead, human and intelligent dinosaur alike, when maybe if things had gone a little differently, none would have died. It was also a tragedy that such an intelligent and beautiful-looking creature had to die because of what happened between the group and its pack. He hoped that the good ones on both sides, from both kinds, would be able to come together in the future and end situations like what had just occurred. The world might have been in ashes at that time, but Ross didn't believe it would stay a crumbled mess forever. He hoped one day the good ones everywhere would come together and fix it. If they could come together, they had a chance to finally fix what had been broken for so long. The road to it, though, he knew, would no doubt be more of the same ugliness that had happened today. If that was the case, then Ross was determined to make sure he protected the good ones for as long as it took for that ugliness to pass. A cawing made him look up. A crow was perched on one of the walls, looking down at him. It called out again before fluttering its wings and flying away. It called a few more times, and the echo quickly faded. Then it was gone. With the danger over, Ross holstered his pistol and strapped it back into place. He then shimmied the idling motorcycle forward, around the dead raptor, whose bright red blood and brain matter was dripping out of her mouth, and back out to the street, where he revved the engine and drove back the way he'd come at full speed. While again crossing the bridge, he stopped to retrieve the rifle he'd lost. He slung it back over his shoulder and then kept driving. Glancing down at the river below for a moment, he didn't see the other two achillibators which had fallen over the side, but he wasn't surprised. He had no doubt they could survive the fall, and figured they'd made it back to one of the banks by then. On each shore were several abandoned barges and pleasure boats, so there were several objects blocking his view of each shoreline, and likely of the raptors too. He sped the bike up and didn't slow down, wanting to put as much distance between him and the other two raptors, wherever they ended up, as possible. He drove back through the city and past the same building the group had been hiding in when he found them. He drove past the idling scooter, and then turned in the direction the trucks had been facing to try and track the others down. He eventually drove through and out of the heart of the forest of skyscrapers and back into the outskirts of the city, to an area filled with smaller buildings, overpasses, and line after line of train tracks. It was only a few minutes after that when he found the others parked on an overpass leading out of the city, waiting for him. The young man, who had been sitting in the bed of the second truck, laughed and gave the deputy a standing ovation when he parked next to the trucks and turned off the bike. "I knew you'd figure it out," he greeted. Ross managed a small smile despite his exhaustion. "I'm surprised you waited," he admitted. "I talked them into waiting for an hour. You are too cool of a dude to leave behind," the young man replied, jumping out of the bed as the leader stepped out of the first truck's driver's side door. Someone willing to ride off into the sunset with the chilibators on their tail and then come back again with his head still attached is worth keeping around, the young man continued, as the group's leader approached the two. All right, the good officer is here. Let's move. The sun is getting very low, he said. Behind them, the city was being cast into a golden glare with an ever-increasing amount of shadows growing between the skyscrapers. Looking at it for a moment, the leader then nodded to Ross. Good job. You earned a place with us today. As he spoke, the others also climbed out and came around to where the three were talking. Ross nodded. Can I have everyone's names, then? He asked. The young man chortled in amusement, and he held out his hand to Ross. I'm Eric, he said, shaking Ross's hand. Despite having only met a little over an hour earlier by holding Ross at gunpoint, he was now acting very friendly to him. Eric looked at the rest of the group. The big man over there is Ronaldo, he said, and the big Latino man nodded curtly, and there was a trace of a smile on his face now. And his friend is Diego, Eric added, and the smaller man, who had been the one to nearly kiss the Achillobator, raised a hand and waved. Eric then motioned to the blonde woman. That's Laurie Harrison, she interrupted, stepping forward and gripping Ross's hand in a firm shake. You did good. Thank you. Ross nodded, and then looked over her shoulder at the blonde man, who hadn't said a word to him, and who was still sneering a tiny bit. What about him? He asked. The leader spoke up. That's Andrew. And I'm Juan, he said. Okay, meet and greet is over. Let's go. The vehicles traveled into the country and turned onto what a reasonable person couldn't even call a back road. It could hardly even be called a track, which led off a highway and ran off through the middle of a forest. Clearly the state did not maintain it, though maybe once it had been paved. The track worked its way deep into the forest and up into the hills. It ended at the top of the highest hill in the area, far from the city, but the hazy outlines of the buildings were still visible in the early evening sunlight. At the top of the hill was a clearing, and in it was where the group's camp was set up, and where the rest of their group was waiting for the others. The area offered a wide view of the surrounding region below the hills for several miles, but the forests all around the camp itself did limit the view of anything approaching from close by, from within the hills and forest themselves. The other people in the group were ecstatic to see their fellows returning after being well past their expected return period. Some had wanted to go to the city to try and find their missing people, but Juan had rules in place that prevented them from doing so. Juan's logic was that if a group went missing on a run, then something likely had proved to be a menace to them, and the others would be better off keeping well away. With the group now back together, ecstatic greetings were shared amongst most, and it took them a moment to notice Ross and realize that he was in the place of one of their own who was missing. Juan relayed the news of everything that had happened in the city, how they'd lost one and taken in another, and then took Ross around and introduced him to everyone else. Giving the deputy the tour, Juan pointed out each member in the group and waved to them. That's David, and that's his cousin Dave. Apparently their mothers thought having near identical names would make for a funny joke. Over there, that's Henry, Olivia, and Ava. Andrew is sitting up in that tree keeping sentry. And the man sulking in the entrance of his tent, like he's brooding over something unpleasant, is Ian. The man was the only one who didn't so much as give Ross a handshake. He didn't even look up at the officer, though he certainly knew the newcomer had arrived. Ross stopped, adjusting his hat to better block the glare from the late afternoon sun. Yeah, he doesn't look too happy, does he? He asked. Juan shook his head. Nope. To tell you the truth, officer, I've never even seen him smile. I half expect him to just steal a truck and drive off one night. He keeps himself away from the rest of us for as much of the day as he can, only helps with an issue if it directly affects him. I think he thinks he's above us. Well, why keep him around if he's a detriment? Juan sighed. What he lacks in colorful personality, he makes up for with smarts. He's very intelligent. I think he was a genetic scientist or animal biologist. I know he wrote some papers about predatory animals. With all the new, old animals running around, he seems like a good person to have around. He knows a lot about how they tend to act in most situations. He knows a lot about what, makes animals tick and stuff. Spends basically all of his time reading these big scientific biology books he has stacked in his tent. He came into possession of a gigantic set about prehistoric animals, and he has biology and evolution stuff in there too. Just give him his space and we'll all get along. He then took Ross to one of the tents, a blue and green one pitched in a circle with the others. This was, our now deceased member's tent. He's not going to need it anymore, so it's yours. Whatever stuff he left in there, consider it yours too, since all you had on you were guns and some other very basic supplies, one said. I hope you understand, but we can't just let you keep everything you had. All the supplies, the guns, food, medicine, it's gonna get distributed to everyone. Ross nodded. Thanks, and that's fine. That was all he could really think to respond with. What more was there to say? One wiped his eyes and motioned to the tent. Um, there's only one thing I want from in there. He motioned to the door, and Ross nodded and unzipped it, flicking the flap open. Juan pointed the item out, and Ross reached in and took it. It was a homemade knife, and it had a polished, handmade wooden sheath. He handed it to Juan. He took it and chuckled softly. His his name was William. We've known each other a long time. We both made identical knives in shop class in high school. Our teacher was one of those who didn't care what we did. Superintendent flipped out, though. I just won't hang on to this. The rest is yours. Juan sniffed. Now that his people were out of danger, he was finally letting himself react to the death of an old friend. Ross opted to give Juan some space and excused himself, not wanting to just sit in the tent. Walking into the camp, he began to explore around. The tents, it seemed everyone had their own, were set up in a circle around a fire pit, and folding chairs were in the center. Off to the side, and a short distance away from the tents, was a shelter house like the ones commonly found in state parks. Some fir steps were set up around the shelter, with picnic tables and more folding chairs underneath. Clothes were strung up to dry between two trees and one of the nearest tree lines. There was an old trailhead that had a marker indicating it led down the hill and to a cave at the spring and stream, which explained where the group got their water supply from. The group also had a decent-sized pile of chopped firewood stacked next to the shelter house. The group members were either hanging out around the shelter, in the fir steps, or near the campfire. It was still smoldering and smoking, but had no open flames. Ross wasn't sure where Lori came from, but suddenly, she was standing right in front of him with a smile. Hey, settling in? Yeah, you all have a good spot here. How'd you find it? We basically all came from the city, or the surrounding area. Juan seemed to know this place was here and brought us up into the hills to keep out of the way of the chaos that was going on once we all banded together. I'm not sure what it is. It's not a state park or forest or anything, so why there's a shelter and trail here, I don't know. It's not for the cave either. It's just a cave, not a landmark. Either way, it's a good spot. Is it secure? Ross asked. Laurie shook her head. Nowhere is secure right now, she said. We plan to move on eventually, but we don't know and we don't have anywhere in mind yet. I think Juan wants us to wait until we get a better idea of what's going on in the rest of the state before we make a move anywhere. A lot of people are doing what we're doing right now, just holding up in the woods and biding time. We've heard a few rumors from people who stopped by then moved on that other survivors are trying to hold up in neighborhoods and old preserved pioneer type villages, places you can fortify, but we've not seen any. Cincinnati has been totally deserted. Some folks who passed through here a while back said they'd heard about some communities being built further to the north and that's where they were trying to head to. Well, I can tell you this. I came down from the north. You're going to want to stay off 127 if you move anywhere in that direction, Ross said, glancing in the direction the road would have been in from his position on the hilltop. He couldn't see the line of it. The horizon faded into a misty haze before he could make the road out. Traffic jam? Lori asked. Ross nodded. Yeah. Lori nodded as well. Those are all over the place. During the winter, people began fleeing the cities to try and find an out of the way place to just wait it all out, and the roads just got blocked. I was in one of those jams on the east side of Cincinnati. Ended up ditching the car and going on foot. Juan and a few others found me on one of their first runs into the city. Took me in. They're a good group of people. Ross smirked a little in response. Well, first impressions weren't great, but yeah, I can see they are. You're a tight knit group. Well, most of us are, Lori responded, glancing over her shoulder at one of the tents. The guy in the tent over there? That's Ian. He's an asshole. He was a scientist before this all struck. Ever since the day he showed up, we can all see that he just has this disdain for us. The only reason he's stuck with this group is that he knows you can't go solo for very long right now and have a hope to live. For now, better to stick with whoever you find, you know? One day, though, we'll all wake up and he'll just be gone, or he'll bail if things seem like they're about to go bad. Till then, though, we have to put up with his major superiority complex and his rants about the glory of science and progress and what potential there is for it to advance now that there won't be any laws holding those back who can still work on anything. Just let him have his way and don't bother him, and you won't have any issues with him. Ian hadn't moved. He was still sitting in the entrance of his tent, reading a thick book about something. Ross thought that, if he squinted, he could make out the word theory on the cover. Outside of Ian's tent was an unlit battery-powered lantern. He had it at the ready for once the sun dropped too low to be enough light. Which wasn't far off. The blinding golden ball was now only just above the tree line, its golden rays casting long shadows into the clearing. Eric was stoking the flames and adding fresh pieces of wood to it, getting the fire built back up. Someone over in the shelter house had already turned on one of the lanterns, just like the one Ian had, which were hanging from the ceiling, and others were setting them up on tables beneath the first ups as well. String lights that people would often use when camping had also been strung up on the first ups, and after being plugged into a surge protector, which was being powered by a car battery, they turned on and illuminated each first up with an orange glow. Juan said the same thing about thinking he'll take off one day, Ross replied. Seems to think he makes up for it with his smarts, though. I got the impression he just puts up with him because he knows a lot about a lot of things. Laurie sighed. I will give him that. He knows a lot about the animals that are running around again. And he has been helpful on a few occasions, showing us a good way to dry meat out so it stays good longer. Only when the issue will affect him, though, if it isn't resolved. But helpful. She shook her head. Anyway, with a lot of the roads blocked and a lot of the bridges destroyed, which basically cut the country in half, we are limited on where we can move when we want to. Thankfully, we haven't seen too many dangerous animals out here. We're kind of tucked off the beaten path, and a lot of the animals have been using the roads to move and migrate because it's easier than the woods. So, we're fine for now. Yeah, I didn't see hardly anything modern or prehistoric on the way down here. The only thing I did see was on the road, Ross said. I'd recommend heading east when you decide to move if it was me. My partner on the force, Sheriff James Vincenzo, headed that way when we went our separate ways this morning. He seemed pretty sure east was the way to go if you could, but any direction other than west is good. Yeah, I heard things are worse out in the west. Sounds like they were hit the hardest by all this. Back in the winter, I heard stories online of people eating each other in those camps out in California. I wonder if anywhere in this country kept their shit together long enough to hold it together, Laurie replied. Well, if anywhere in the US did, we certainly haven't found it, and it certainly wasn't out on the West Coast, Ross responded. Laurie nodded. Well, if nothing forces us out of this area, I think Juan wants to stay here at least until midsummer. He hopes by then that things will be a little more stable. We'll then find a place to wait the winter out. Until then, though, this is home, and the city is our department store for stuff we can't find anywhere else or make ourselves. Now, come on. I'll take you over to the others so you can properly meet. No one here is going to try and meet and eat, right? Ross asked with a small smile. Laurie laughed. No raptors here, don't worry. And no cannibals in this camp either. We're not in California. We stayed civilized. My partner and I on the force before all of this, Ross said, gesturing to the air around him. We were trying to catch this serial killer. Y'all probably saw the name. Waterside Reaper on the news? That was him. We were trying to find evidence to connect our suspect, who we know was the guy. We had no doubt. So we could arrest him. No luck. He covered his tracks too good. Even indirectly would tell us he was the guy when we would talk to him at the station. Not in any terminology we could use as an actual confession, but in a way that we knew what he meant. It had been dark for a few hours at that point, and the group had gathered to sit around the crackling campfire and let their new arrival give a proper introduction to everyone. Ross was the only one present who was any kind of law enforcement or first responder, so there was a great deal of curiosity directed towards him. The group listened while the deputy recounted the story of the tiring and frustrating case that had plagued him and Vincenzo for the last few months, before the apocalypse had begun creeping up on everyone and breathing down their necks like a predator about to strike. All their gazes were on the officer, while he gazed down into the flames and recounted. To no one's surprise, Ian had not joined the group around the fire. After eating, he'd gone back to his tent and sat back down in the entrance, lantern now on, and reading from his book once again. Dinner had been meat from a deer the group had hunted a few days prior, and some canned vegetables mixed into a stew cooked over the fire once it was hot enough. After supper, and after everyone had migrated to the chairs set up around the fire, more wood had been added to build the flames up, and everyone's faces were cast into dancing shadows. The night air was filled only with the crackling of the flames and the chirping and singing of nighttime insects. So, we were on his trail for months. Sometimes, 2 days a week, we'd have a report of a body washing up on the riverbank, always melted with acid and bleach before being dumped into the water to destroy any forensic evidence. If acid and bleach was all that was done to them, then it was a good day. Some of the victims were just... Butcher doesn't even describe it. It doesn't come close. Then the world started falling apart. Bigger issues were dropped onto our already full plates, and we never had a chance to catch him. He vanished from town very quickly after it all started happening, or at the very least he held up somewhere and didn't come back out. I'd say he was one of those people who retreated to the woods to write it out. He's probably out there somewhere, free to keep doing the same stuff with no fear of being caught anymore. Not that he had that anyway. Ross continued with a sigh, one of resignation over the fact that he could no longer do anything about it anymore. He was a damn psychopath, he added, shaking his head. After a moment, he continued. When things started going bad out west, then everywhere else. Vincenzo, myself, and the others on the force basically did everything we could to keep everyone in our small town calm. We tried to get everyone in town to just keep together and ride it out. And we were. Almost no one opted to leave. And one night in the middle of winter, everything changed. A line of refugees were passing through our town, and while the bridge going over to Indiana, over the river, was gridlocked with cars filled with scared families. The military came in and bombed it. It was completely destroyed, and the center of it just collapsed into the water. I don't want to think about how many people died that night. Things really began falling apart afterwards, and families and officers alike just began packing and leaving in droves. Eventually, as of last week, it was just me and Vincenzo left, and this morning, we both also left. I hope his day wasn't as exciting as mine. A few people chuckled, and Eric, who was sitting across the fire from Ross, spoke up. You know, even when the supply chains were basically non existent and people were rioting in the street, my manager still made me come to work. Why the hell did you go in? Because the store had already been mostly picked clean by thieves and panic buyers. The looters were starting to target homes instead, so I dressed mine up to look like it had been looted and then went somewhere I knew wouldn't be hit for a few hours until it calmed down again. I tell you, there is nothing like the thrill of restocking shelves when you're expecting looters to rush inside at any moment. Just because your boss thinks everything will be fine and we need to be ready to sell products to customers again once it calms down. I think he was expecting everything to eventually pass, like a hurricane always does down south, or a tornado does out in the Midwest. He shrugged. Believe me, if I could do it over again, I'd tell him off and stay home. But at the time, part of me didn't think it would get any worse, and I didn't want to give up that last feeling of normalcy I had. And if, on the off chance things did end up smoothing back over again, I would have liked to have still had a job. But it was more wanting to hold on to the few things that still felt normal. I did the same thing in my own way, Ross said. Went to the station every morning, clocked in, did my morning foot patrol, even after people were being mauled by raptors while walking alone outside of their homes. It's hard to let routine go away, especially for such a tumultuous trade-off in return. What was the first sign of what was to come that you saw, Ross? Laurie asked, from her spot next to Eric. Ross looked across the fire towards her. It was last October, about 2 months before things became widespread. Farmer hit a young Therizinosaurus on the back road outside of town. Vincenzo tried to tell me it was just a malformed turkey, until I brought it into the station and shoved it under his nose. We didn't know what it was at the time. How about you? Raptor. It was a raptor, Laurie replied. I saw a picture someone uploaded to social media of one of one of that their game camera had taken a picture of. It was this big, long-snouted, bird-looking thing with glowing white eyes. It had just snowed, so the owner went out to the spot the next day and shared pictures as they followed its tracks deeper into the woods. When they uploaded one picture of them following the tracks up a hill, someone commented that they thought they saw the raptor in a bush ahead of the uploader. Then there was nothing else. Well, I suppose it goes without saying, especially after what happened in the city, but the large dromaeosaurs are not to be underestimated. One of the very first reports of things starting to go bad in my town involved one. I said people were being mauled by them for a reason. It was only a few weeks after I saw my first dinosaur. This woman called into the station, screaming, shouting, It's eating my husband! It's eating my husband! They lived outside of town, and he'd been leaving the house for work when one ambushed him from the woods. By the time we got there and shot the raptor, he didn't have a face anymore. This was around the same time everyone was beginning to accept something was wrong, so we sent the pictures to a paleontologist. He said it was a Utah raptor, but larger than any fossilized specimens, Ross explained. What else happened? From what you said, it sounds like you guys kept things pretty orderly in your town for a while, Lori asked. Ross nodded. We worked around the clock. Some guys pulled 24-hour shifts, and we were lucky. Our town was mostly untouched by the worst of it. Some hunters noticed a substantial drop in the deer population, though, and one of them said he was chased out of the woods by something big. He said it chased him through the woods the whole way back to his truck. I think it was the same thing that paid us a visit that night. We were spared some of the worst effects, but we weren't unscathed. Ross paused for a moment and then continued. A whole bunch of people called in that night, saying something big was roaming the neighborhood. I kid you not. When a bunch of us officers went out and found it, it was a giant, 6-foot tall quadrupedal crocodile, and it was 30 feet long. Imagine seeing that get illuminated by your high beams at night. It was standing high enough to make eye contact with you through your windshield. Was it a Barinasuchus? Eric asked. Ross nodded. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And we were able to look it up the next day. Oh, I'll never forget that sight, though, of it first appearing illuminated in the car lights. It was raining that night, and its eyes first appeared as just two glowing orbs. Then the body seemed to materialize. As we just stared out of the windshield, it roared and tried to attack us. It suddenly came at us in a gallop. Seeing a crocodile gallop, it's off-putting. It's wrong. Worst night of all this before the bombing. Things eventually got to where a day didn't go by that there wasn't a new video or a picture of a sighting put on the internet, but I was more focused on keeping things in my town under control, Ross said. Thankfully, aside from a few incidents, there wasn't much in our immediate area. Like I said, we were spared from a lot of the chaos. It was only after the bridges got bombed that people decided to abandon ship. You know, I saw a lot of those early videos that spread around. I remember this one that went viral of a pterosaur flying over a hiker. Thought it was fake at first. It was so pixelated like all those videos always are, but nope. Eric shook his head and chuckled softly. Other than what happened today, how have you all managed? Ross then asked. We've been doing a lot of running to the city to get supplies we need, Juan spoke up, having only just sat down with the others a few moments prior. Fortunately, that last trip was a bust. We still need supplies from the city, so I have to make a run back soon. What's in the city that comes out at night? Ross asked. You didn't give me a straight answer before. Juan didn't respond right away, but then he sighed and sat up a little straighter and looked across the flames at Ross. Like I told you on the roof, some of the animals are more dangerous than others. There's more out there than just the talking ones. There's something dangerous in that city that comes out at night. It's a mammalian-looking thing with white fur that walks on all fours. I don't know what it is, but it's taller than a person. We spent one night in the city early on and saw it in action. After that, I made a rule that we don't do that anymore. Then we spent last night huddled in the dungeon and didn't make a peep to avoid attracting attention. That was the only time the Achillebators ran off, but we didn't dare try driving out at night. They came back at first light, though, before we even had a chance to make a run for the trucks. Juan paused for a moment and then continued. I don't know what it is. It might be something that was altered by the anomaly. If we compare the anomaly to a virus again, and the animals different strains of it, then the strains all had plenty of rare variants. It didn't just resurrect all the extinct animals in the same form they once lived. Some are exactly like they were before, yes, but others aren't. The talking ones were just the ones that got noticed because they were so unexpected. Look at Velociraptor, for example. They're small, covered in feathers, and kind of cute. But then, the anomaly turned some of them into featherless, talking ones that are as big as the biggest Utah raptors. Then there's some like that which still have feathers while others don't. Hence why I called them variants. They're the same animal, but they're also completely different too. In a way, they're like a variant of the same virus. Those raptors we saw in the city today were, according to what I've read, larger than they ought to have been, and they could talk, which obviously other, more common members of their genus couldn't and can't. So again, the animal is the same, but the anomaly, whatever it was, altered some individuals drastically. Some, apparently, have essentially everything special to us that makes us human. They can be kind, be friendly, and show empathy. I've heard stories of people even befriending some like that. Then there's others that are smarter but don't have that extra layer like the other talking ones. They don't feel compassion or empathy like people. They're just animals with the intelligence of humans but none of the emotion that makes us humans. There's probably others too that we just don't know about. Maybe some which are smart like people but can't talk, for example. Juan's theory was sound, and its implications were unsettling to everyone. Lori ended up speaking up next. That could actually explain why certain animals which needed different atmospheric conditions or oxygen levels are doing just fine in our modern world. Like the big bugs from the Carboniferous. Oxygen levels back then were over 30% higher than today, but the big bugs are just fine now. Those big eagle-sized dragonflies are really annoying too. But something about them has to be different if they're able to survive in our atmosphere, and it applies to other animals too. I've seen videos of people encountering prehistoric fish, which should be in salt water, but they're in freshwater bodies. I didn't really think about it till now, but it's the same idea. So, things are probably even more mixed up than any of us realized, Eric said. Yeah, and you also need to remember that it's not just the dinosaurs that are back, it's every animal that ever went extinct. Even something that died out as recently as a year ago or less now has a new chance. Now, will they all last in this new world? No. It's simply too many animals from too many different times who need too many different ecosystems for everything to coexist forever. But we need to keep in mind there are also animals that went extinct in the last century which are just as lethal as any dinosaur, and it's obvious at this point they were just dropped everywhere and not where they originally lived. As a group, we have to be ready to encounter anything. A Caspian tiger could hunt you as effectively as any other extinct big cat like Smilodon or any carnivorous dinosaur like Utahraptor. You have to be ready to encounter anything from any time at any location, one said, pressing the point. Ross hadn't really understood that before, but he remembered that he read that Barinasuchus was from South America and not Ohio. At the time, he didn't really understand the implications, but he was beginning to now. Realizing one was right made Ross feel numb inside. And not to mention whatever the hell happened in France. That was one of the very last things I heard about the international situation before the news went down, Laurie said. She looked like she'd pitied the people who lived in Europe. Sounds like something really bad happened over there that we didn't get hit with here. Like what? Ross asked, intrigued. Laurie shook her head. I don't know. I just know that France was holding out better than most governments, second only to New Zealand from what I've heard, and then all of a sudden they collapsed really quickly because of something. The last thing I heard was that they were deploying their own military to try and stop it, Sounded like a whole war was about to break out in the countryside around Paris because of whatever happened over there. I heard it was all about trying to stop something from spreading. Not the anomaly's effects per se, but something else, Eric added. But I was more worried about what was happening in this country to focus on the details of what was going down in Europe. Laurie noticed that Ross looked slightly confused, even with the shadows dancing across his face from the fire, and asked, "You're a cop. There's no way you didn't hear about that, Tim." Ross shrugged a little. "I guess I was more focused on what was happening at home. My town was falling into chaos by the time the news went down, and all my attention was on trying to keep people calm. Most I heard about overseas were rumors about something weird happening in Europe. Like I said, I didn't focus on something so far away from home when my hands were already full. Hell was already here, and I was trying to protect the people with an ever decreasing police force. Local and national news was all I ever let myself have time to listen to. The international scene was just not on my mind," he admitted. "So, what happened in Europe?" Ross asked after a moment. Laurie looked around and the others shrugged. "I was hoping you knew more," she said. "None of us really know. No full picture was ever reported." "Guess it doesn't matter now, though, since it's a whole ocean away." A new voice spoke up, for the first time the entire evening. "What happened in France was the direct result of brilliant minds and science alike being molested by those who don't understand how complex such matters are. Had they let their scientists do their work without interruption, or fear of time running out, they likely would have had a better outcome," Ian said from his tent, looking up from his book for the first time since supper. Everyone turned their gazes to look at him. "What do you know?" Laurie asked. Ian's gaze was unreadable, and after a moment of locking eyes with her, he simply looked back down at his book and didn't respond further. Laurie scoffed and turned back around to the fire. "Asshole," she muttered. "You know, Ian, you have so much knowledge on these animals that you could help us out with the guesswork rather than just sitting silent and brooding in your tent," she added, speaking with her voice raised to address him without turning around to face him. Ian didn't reply. A short silence fell over the group, with no one speaking and their eyes all staring into the flames. After a few minutes of silence, Eric was the one who spoke up again, sounding like he was speaking his thoughts out loud without realizing it. Virus." When he realized that everyone had turned to look at him, he added, "I was just thinking about one's virus comparison. It reminded me about how the CDC was apparently working on trying to make a virus that would wipe out the prehistoric animals. Never got anywhere with it, though." Laurie snorted, shaking her head in annoyed disbelief. "That was a stupid idea to begin with. There are too many variables and too many completely different, unrelated species appearing around the planet. Plus, how do you make something that only infects what we call prehistoric animals and not modern day ones?" "Short version, you don't," Juan replied. "Where do you even draw that line anyway?" Eric commented. "Where does prehistoric even begin and end? Or what species that were already alive today counted as prehistoric themselves? Some animals around today have been around for millions of years already. Horseshoe crabs have been persistent for the last 400 million years, give or take. Do you count them as modern animals or prehistoric ones?" "Exactly. It was clearly a plan born out of desperation," Laurie replied. "You can't make a virus that infects an anomalocyrus and a tyrannosaurus and some extinct deer from 50,000 years ago, but not a raven or a cow or... You get the idea. Too many vastly different animals you want and don't want to infect. Just stupid all around. You can't make one thing that infects completely different animals from across 500 million years. It's..." She looked up from the fire and saw the confusion on Ross's face and laughed in good-natured amusement. "I think the good sheriff over there is lost," she said. The others chuckled as well, not in a mocking way, but more of a good-natured poking fun at way. Ross shook his head. I don't know anything about biology or prehistoric animals. What's an anomalachirus? Ian snapped from his tent, as if it was the most simple word to ever pronounce ever. There he goes again. I swear, I think he thinks we're the most incompetent doomed hicks he ever met, Laurie said with a small snort. Eric nodded and finished his statement. Yeah. Anyway, Anomalachirus, it's an arthropod. Like a park scorpion, but it swims. Was about 3 feet long and lived a little over 500 million years ago, give or take, in an ocean where most animals are only a few inches long, so it was an absolute monster. There were a lot of things in the oceans back then, and now, I guess, that looked like monsters. Seriously, some of the animals from back then would make anything in modern shark horror movies look like a goldfish, Laurie agreed. So, what was it that attacked us today? Ross asked. You said the name, but I don't remember exactly what it was. The chilibators, Eric repeated. One of the biggest dromaeosaurs, one added. Same family as the velociraptor, but way bigger. Typically, they aren't Utahraptor big, but those ones we ran into sure were. From what we've seen, though, the talking ones usually seem to be bigger. Rarer, but always more dangerous. Juan chuckled as Ross began to look overwhelmed. You got some hard reading to do, good officer. If you want to survive in this world, you gotta know what's in it. I'll set you up. I hit pay dirt recently and found this multi-volume set of encyclopedia-type books recently published with all the most up-to-date information on every known prehistoric animal that ever lived. Each volume is dedicated to a specific era, and some are in multiple parts. You can start reading in the morning. Juan stood up. Welcome to the group, good officer. Your new life in a new world starts tomorrow. For now, it's time to hit the hay, he said, not speaking to Ross, but the whole group. Everyone nodded and began to stand up. As the group began to disperse, Ross looked around to everyone before he hurried up behind Ronaldo, wanting to speak with him, but not having had a chance yet. Hey, hold up a second, Ross said, and Ronaldo stopped and turned around to face him. Hey, you from the U.S.? Ross asked. A moment later, Ross realized how it must have sounded from the slightly peeved look on Ronaldo's face, and he quickly clarified, I just meant that if you were from south of the border, I was wondering if you knew anything about what happened down there. I heard on the news the cartels were overrunning the country weeks ago. Ronaldo, seeing Ross meant no offense, sighed and nodded. I was born here, in the city. My old lady immigrated back to Mexico after I moved away from home. She lived in Tijuana, and last time I heard from her, she said the cartels were overrunning everything and seizing power, forcing people to be workers or human shields in their proxy wars for power. The border had already closed, so there was no way she could get back north. We eventually lost contact, and I don't want to think about what happened to her. She told me don't come. Don't try to come for her. That it was happening all over Mexico and throughout Central America. She said everything was on fire and people were doing more damage than the animals. That was the last thing we talked about. I didn't even get to tell her I love her one final time. Ronaldo stopped and sniffed, wiping his eyes a moment later. Diego is all I have now. He's not blood, but he's family. I'm sorry to hear that. Well, if you ask me, the time for us to be divided by lines in the sand is over. We're all one people now. It's a pleasure to formally meet you, Ross replied. He held out his hand, and Ronaldo took it. They shook hands, and Ronaldo chuckled. You seem like a good one. Happy I didn't whack you with that pipe today. They both chuckled at the comment, and Ronaldo added, You're with us now. Really stuck your neck out to save us when you had no reason to. I've got your back. From now to whenever the next doomsday is. He patted Ross on the shoulder, and they nodded to each other, and turned to go their separate ways for the night. After a moment, Ronaldo stopped and turned around again, adding, And it wasn't just the big 7 cartels fighting across Mexico that everyone was afraid of, he said. Ross looked at him, and the large man continued. According to my old lady, she said that when things were breaking down, that the Cuatro Brazos cartel was moving north out of Central America. Even the most dangerous cartels in Mexico are afraid of them. I think some of them were trying to bring so many others under their flag so they could fight back when they finally arrived. Even in the dim light, Ross's face visibly drained of color. Oh shit, he breathed. The Cuatro Brazos? They'll wipe everyone out they can't use. Hell, their leader, Thomas Rees, makes the serial killer I was trying to catch look like a nice guy. He's been in the top 5 of the FBI's 10 most wanted list for the better part of a decade. Rees had committed some of the worst human rights violations in recent history. What he would do now, in a truly lawless world, made Ross feel sick to his stomach. He was grateful he wasn't anywhere near Rees would be. Not looking like he really knew what to say, Ronaldo simply nodded and turned to walk away again, looking like he was grieving the loss all over again. After a moment and not being able to find any words, Ross started to do the same, but this time he was the one who turned around after a moment. Hey, Ronaldo, he called out. If you ever learn any indication that she's still alive, I'll go with you myself to help bring her out of there safely, Ross said. Ronaldo looked surprised at the offer, but after a moment, he nodded with a grateful expression. Then they parted ways, each heading to their own tents. Ross saw out of the corner of his eyes as someone at the shelter house turned off the lights and lanterns. He couldn't tell who it was due to only seeing their silhouette, but it looked like Henry. Once the lights were out, the campfire was the only light left in the camp, save some lanterns on in a few tents, including Ian's. Ross approached his tent and crouched to unzip the door. As he did, he heard someone call out, "Good officer." He stopped and stood up, seeing Juan standing by his own tent with his arms crossed. Juan was waving him over with the flick of a finger, and Ross approached. Once Ross was a few steps away, Juan sighed and looked him in the eyes. What you did for us today, that was a good start to earning your place. Hell, you did earn it. Prove it wasn't a fluke guided by self-preservation and you'll be with us for good. But listen, I'm sure you understand that I can't trust any new person completely just yet. Not in this world, not with these people. We've become a family. Until you earn my full trust, know this. If you do anything that hurts them... He paused and looked side to side for a moment before looking Ross dead in the eyes again. Modern medicine and the most talented doctors all in a room wouldn't be able to fix what I do to you. Look, some people are still figuring things out. That's fine. Not everyone adjusts to such a change right away. You're still thinking like you were before the apocalypse. You're still a cop in your mind. That's fine. Take your time to figure things out, adjust to this world with no rules, and brace for the ugly things you'll have to do. But I'm not thinking like I did before. I've figured out what you have to be ready to do. I'm capable of damn near anything, and I will do anything to keep these people I love safe. I'd die for these people, gladly. I'd also kill someone to keep them safe. Got that? Don't wrong them. As he spoke, there was a dark gleam in his eyes, and it made Ross wonder what Juan had been forced to do to keep the others safe already. He didn't want to know. Ross nodded. Yeah, I've got it. Juan smiled and nodded, then the friendly look returned to his eyes. Okay, welcome to the troop then. I really think you are a good one, for the record. I saw your talk with Ronaldo. You hold the good values of a police officer near and dear. I like that, even if you're still a bit stuck with how things used to be. You hold on to those values. Not enough people trying to help each other these days, he said, and extended a hand. Ross shook it. Thanks. And you don't have to worry about me. As a whole, these are good people. I want to help keep them alive. I'd do what I did today again if I had to. Hell, I'd lead a Tyrannosaurus away on that bike if it meant saving them, Ross promised. So would I, Juan agreed. So would I. Ross smiled. For the first time in a long time, he was happy. He was happy knowing that he would not only get to serve and protect people again, the thing he loved most about being a cop in the old world, but that he now had a whole group of people he could continue to do so with. With that, he climbed into his tent. As Ross fell asleep, he heard the sounds of two kauai-oos singing in the nearby trees. Two birds whose song could finally be sung again. Ross had once listened to the recording of the last male, and it had made him feel sad, but now he could hear the duet finally being sung by a pair. Even if they didn't last, even if the species lived again for only a short time, they'd been given a chance like everything else. Finally, their song could be whole again, instead of being sung by only one who never heard the other complete the duet. The anomaly might have destroyed so much, but not all of its effects on the Earth were ugly ones. There was still some beauty. That was a nice thought. There was a chance for good things to come from the disaster, and he'd make sure the good group of people he'd found were able to enjoy that future when they finally arrived in it. The deputy had found a new purpose, and he could let the old world be put into his past with peace.